Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jay Mays, aka Jarrell Mason, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them flowers right here to be celebrated. With me right now, I have a man who I've been wanting to have on my podcast for a very long time. He's a writer, a historian of music, Mr. Sheldon Taylor. We're going to get into music, all that, and then some with him. So, Sheldon, thank you for coming on Beyond the Album Cover, and this has been long overdue.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, I appreciate you taking the time. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Where you're from, where you're born. Do you remember where you first purchased a music album, cassette, CD, or whatever you with your own money?
Yes, I am from Gary, Indiana. I currently live in Dover, Delaware now, but I was born in Gary, Indiana. Spent all of my formative years there until I was about 18. And I moved on and joined the military and stayed in the military for about 24 years. And then I moved over into education and civil service. And I landed here in Delaware back in 2010. Now, to answer your question, as far as the first music that I ever bought with my own money, I have to go back. Well, I have to preface 1979 is the turning point for me when I first started buying music with my own money. I always wanted to buy R&B records, when I was young. However, obviously I didn't have the money. I'm was born in 1968, so I'm a 70s and 80s baby. So I was well aware of all of the music that was actually going on at the time. It was my interest was highly piqued, but I didn't have the money to buy the records at 6, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, and I was just regulated to the kid records that my mother would buy me when I was a child. But right around 1979, that was the turning point where I remember my mother taking me to the store and the records that I was able to buy. And back then they were 45 records. Albums were about $9, $10 back then, which is probably the equivalent of $15, $25 now, which was a fortune back then. But the records that I bought with my own money, it was Michael Jackson's um, Rock With You. It was The Whispers and the Beat Goes On, Shalimar the second time around, Prince, I Want to Be Your Lover, Kool and the Gang, Ladies Night. So all of those records that were hot in 1979 going into 1980 were some of the records that I first bought on with my own money.
Okay, and you mentioned you served in the military. I just want to say thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you mentioned you were born and raised in Gary, Indiana, and we all know the
Yes.
musical pedigree that comes out of Gary, Indiana, with the Jackson family, the Powells, rest in peace, Jesse Powell, Denise Williams, and later on Freddie Gibbs is from Gary, Indiana as well. So, was it that you think it is about Gary to have all of those successes come out of that area? Was it something that had to do with being in close proximity to Chicago? And with the working culture that came with U.S. Steel that was prominent in Gary at the time.
Well, I want to preface that Denise Williams was my Head Start bus driver. So before she started to get into the music business fully, she was my bus driver, when I was 4 or 5 years old going to Head Start back then. So we're talking about maybe 1972, 1973. So in Gary, Indiana, obviously it's an industrial place, driven by the steel mills and whatnot. But during that time period, um, what's known as Music Row, Record Row in Chicago, was still active during that time. There's a period of time, obviously going back to the 20s and 30s and the 40s, there was jazz going on, but Chicago was kind of self-contained, where they had their own record pressing plants. Mercury Records was there. They had a series of different types of small clubs and venues. Curtis Mayfield's record company, Curtom, was there. So you had a reference during that time period for people who were making music in the 70s. Obviously, you go back to the history of the Jackson Five. Joe Jackson formed alliances with DJs and people in the Chicago entertainment industry to further the career of his children. Denise Williams made her earliest records there. Obviously, we know about Minnie Riperton and other people. So at the time, going into the late 70s, record roll was kind of on its last legs. You know, at the time, there were a lot of regional records that were extremely popular that didn't go beyond the Midwest. So at the time when the music industry, obviously it spread out to New York and California and things of that nature, a lot of the labels, they kind of lost their distribution. And so you had a situation where record roll kind of died, the industry kind of died down. But I would say, you know, at the time period, 50s, 60s, going into roughly about 1980, you saw that there was an avenue for people in that Chicago, Gary, Indiana area to make records. Now, based on the varying degrees of success, well, that remains to be seen. Obviously, you know, if you've heard of the Five Stair Steps, they made records there with Curtis Mayfield. But I would say 1980 was the cutoff point. So it was a reference that was there. As far as Gary, Indiana, it had about 5 or 6 schools that were there, and those schools were steeped into that. Those schools had various music programs. There were outlets for people to play music. Obviously, in Gary, Indiana, they had talent shows that would come out every year, and those talent shows obviously were where the Jackson Five came through. You know, we talk about them performing at a high school called Roosevelt High School, and that's where they started to get their name out there, when they started winning talent shows. And if you go back and listen to the Jackson Five's song, going back to Indiana, they reference Roosevelt High. So you had that reference that was there, but moving beyond that, once the Chicago industry died down in terms of entertainment, you didn't have any musical outlets. Probably, we're looking at probably until like the 1990s, when you see, well, actually going into the 2000s, when you see the Twisters and everybody else coming out. So it was kind of a desolate time period from 1980 till about, you know, the early 2000s, mid 90s, late 90s. I think there was a rap group that was they did a record called Po Pimpin', 95. I would say from 80 to 95, it kind of was like a drought that was there. So
Mhm.
anybody that wanted to be in the music business, they had to go to California. They had to go to New York. But based on the people in their age group, let's say anybody that was probably born in the mid 60s, going back before the mid 60s, there was an outlet to be seen. Unlike today, where the music industry is infiltrated with a lot of younger people. Back then, the music industry was driven by adults. So you had influential DJs at different radio stations who were also promoting. So unlike now, where someone that wants to be in the music business, it can be extremely challenging, even though we're dealing with the streaming, we're dealing with the different outlets that exist. But during that time period, Black America had just a series of network of clubs and things of that nature where Black people could actually perform. You know, I would say during that time period, R&B revolved around its own orbit, because in
Mhm.
Black neighborhoods they had clubs, they had DJs, they had radio stations, they had promoters. So even though it wasn't a situation how it is now, where a person can actually go out there and now you're being seen like a Justin Bieber and you're doing music videos and things of that nature, the performance element and the promotional element was there. So all of those kind of components influenced people who were looking to be in the music business in the Gary, Indiana, Chicago region.
Right, and you mentioned how after Music Row and everything died down, that it wasn't until the mid '90s when the Midwest got put back on the map, the Chicago area with the rap scene with Common Sense, who now Common, Crucial Conflict,
That's the
Twista,
one.
Do or
Yes.
Die, and then later on Kanye West, Rhyme Fest, and everybody to come out of Chicago. But it was really that whole scene that you mentioned earlier that kind of started it all. Now, was Stilltown Records based out of Gary, and was Big Boy by the Jacksons a regional hit before they took off nationally with getting signed to Motown?
Yes, Steeltown was based out of Gary. What people don't realize that during that time, if you go back to the 50s and the 60s, music was extremely regional. It wasn't national at that point, where you had all of the Atlantics and the Warner Brothers and all the major labels that were able to, put music out to the masses. Music started out period, it was a regional component. So you had records that could be released in southern markets. You had records released in on the East Coast market. You had records that were released on the West Coast market. And during that time period, music was extremely regional. You didn't have a conglomerate of record labels. That's how you had Motown doing their thing, Stax doing their thing, Curtom doing their thing, different small labels out on the West Coast. So before the music business became a corporate entity, music was extremely regional. So that allowed record labels like Steeltown to come up. There was also another record label that was very prominent in the 50s and the 60s that was called VJ Records. And VJ Records, the people who started that, they were from Gary, Indiana, and they had Chicago affiliations. And with them, they had access. They were the ones who released the very first Beatles album in America, because EMI Records over in Europe established a distribution situation with VJ. So VJ was the first label to really introduce Beatles music in America. But unfortunately, with a lot of those regional labels, they didn't have partnerships. It was kind of more like a shoestring type situation with Steeltown and other labels. So they really couldn't grow. So when you look at, go ahead, you got a question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so it's pretty much more like it wasn't, whereas what we see now, where if you see an indie label that's booming, a major's gonna come in and say, we're gonna be the parent, distribute your stuff, get your product out. So it was almost like in the regional territory days of wrestling, where you had certain markets where only certain stars flourished. But then when Vince McMahon came in and said, we're gonna gobble up the territories, we're gonna make it one big national promotion. So it's where the music industry back then was kind of following that same philosophy.
Exactly. And what it is that when it came to black music specifically, black music was extremely regional. So even though people would hear records, the 45s of the day, they may hear songs on the radio. They didn't know who they looked like. So there was a period of time in New York, they had their own production style, which was in the 60s, that was heavily string based. We know what the Stax gritty music sound was. So there was a period of time where the artists who were making these music, that was making the music, they didn't know each other until they started, doing the whole Chitlin circuit thing, and you people got a chance to kind of interact and things of that nature. But with black music, most importantly, is that people have to understand black music was like a secondary entity. And a lot of the major labels did not know how to promote black music. That's why when you saw Motown first, before they did their thing, they went to Chicago and were affiliated with Chess Records to distribute their music. Um, Gamble and Huff eventually had to go. They had Neptune Records, they had Gamble Records, independent labels, and then they had to partner up with Clive Davis and CBS. So you don't see the growth of black music on a corporate level, being able to have those corporate dollars obviously into the 70s. We know what happened with Stax. Stax was kind of independent for a long time, and then they had a partnership with Atlantic in the late 60s, and that relationship deteriorated. There's a lot of documentaries that are out there on that. But unfortunately, you did not have in Gary and those surrounding areas a distribution. The perfect example, because I know you're a music historian. Ready for the World was like that. Ready for the World, when they put out their first record, Tonight, they created their own label in Flint, Michigan. I think it was called Blue Lake or something like that. And what happened was they were able to somehow or another hook up with Gerald Busby at the time. And Gerald Busby was the one that was kind of able to catapult them into the national spectrum. But I remember when Tonight came out in 1985, that was a popular record where we were at, and it was just a regional record at that time. So that's a perfect example. That's a general example.
Right. You mentioned Ready for the World and how another Midwest person, Prince, and then all the associated acts, the Time, Bandy Six, Apollonia Six, the Family, how all those acts in the Midwest, like Ready for the World, Dream Boy, The Deal, heavily influenced by Prince, the Time, and everything that was coming out of Minneapolis.
And one of those things, when you look at the Deal and all those other groups, what allowed those groups to thrive, once again, I have to reiterate this, is that, in the 70s and going into the 80s, you had places for people to perform, because obviously back then music was always a performing outlet first. So if you were a musician, it was about learning the songs of the day to get your musical skills tight to be able to perform on stage before you even had a record. So when you look at a lot of groups, even those Ohio funk groups, back then there was a venue, different black neighborhoods, different main streets in black neighborhoods or whatever, where you can actually go to clubs and perform. That was a thing. So unlike the next wave of music coming in, late 80s, New Jack Swing and everything else, the music is studio driven. It wasn't necessarily performance driven, because by that time you started seeing in black America, the cities started to go down. When Reagan came into office, they weren't putting as much money into the cities post riots. Well, before, when they had the riots, they were building the cities. Jimmy Carter was really, who just passed away, who was an advocate of putting money back into the cities, because they're coming on the heels of that urban unrest. So circa 1980, when Reagan comes into office, a lot of places, a lot of black communities, the venues changed. So where now you didn't have clubs on main streets in black neighborhoods for people to perform. And of course, we do know, just like when we look at the mediums that exist, where we looked at the physical product of music that made the shift to streaming, also there's a change in the medium, because there's a certain era of black people during that time when they wanted to experience music. They went out to concerts, they went out to small clubs, they went to small venues to listen to music. And you already know, with you being an 80s kid, is that once the music shifted to where now music videos became a thing, that was the schism between the past and the present. So now it's more about my visual, and it's less about me having musical skill sets to be able to perform, because now the artists they're starting to slant younger, but there was no outlet for them to follow that same tradition to play in black clubs and black venues. And then of course you see, right around that same time, you see the advent of accessible technology, keyboards, drum machines. So it's changing the whole dynamic of the creation of music. It's
Mm.
also changing the whole dynamic of the delivery of music.
Right, and I want to circle back to music being regional, and you mentioned the connection between Gary and Chicago. Can you talk about the importance of WVON in that whole regional scene and how they helped launch a lot of those careers? We had Herb Kent, the cool gent, come out of WVON. Don
Yes.
Cornelius, who was a backup announcer, fill in at WVON before going to launch Soul Train, which was originally a local show, I believe, on WCIU channel 26 before it ended up going national in 71. They still kept the local version going for a couple of years, which was hosted by another gentleman once Don took it out west. But how Don got into WVON was he pulled over a gentleman for speeding, and the gentleman told him, "Hey, you got a voice radio." And the gentleman was Warwood Sr., who was the dad of Warwood Jr., comedian.
Yes, I'm gonna tell you, Chicago during that time in the 50s and the 60s, even prior to that, but definitely since we're on that time frame that you spoke of, very influential. Like I said, during that period, black music revolved around its own orbit. So in addition to having small record labels that were out there, you had the venues. You also had the radio stations and the DJs prior to, we talk about, hear about Frankie Crocker, we hear about this one, but every city had their own radio stations that was geared to black music, and they had influential DJs. And those DJs were very important because those DJs broke the records, they promoted the records, they were had relationships with people who performed, who own the venues, to where now the artist can play. WVON, the voice of the Negro. That was the name of, that was the call sign, and that radio station was extremely important and influential. There were other radio stations as well, but WVON was extremely popular. Herb Kent, obviously very influential, and his radio, he goes back to the early 50s. He's since passed, probably within the past maybe 10 years ago, but he spent almost 60 plus years in radio. So he was extremely important because back then, Chicago, in his era in the 50s and 60s, it was blues. It was a blues component. So you had that, and then you had homegrown R&B stars, Eugene Record, Shy Lights, Major Lance, whose daughter wound up becoming the mayor of Atlanta. So you had a lot of homegrown people there that were stars. You had Brunswick Records that was there, so you had a space that was actually there, that was available, that people can look to. So you had that activity going on in Chicago. So if I'm Denise Williams, or if I am the Jackson family, I'm Joe Jackson, there's a possibility that exists. When you look at Gary in Chicago, it's only a 45-minute, 35 to 45-minute drive. So that connection was there. So Chicago was always like that beacon. So before Joe Jackson was even thinking about Motown, remember when he was dealing with his sons, we're talking about 67, 68, 65, 66, 67, 68. So it's not until 68 when he starts to now even think about Motown. So Chicago is the number one city that he went to. But the great thing about Joe Jackson's timing is that by him steering the Jacksons to Motown, that saved them, because as the record roll was dying, Jackson's probably just would have been known as a regional act. No disrespect to the Five Stair Steps, who were an outstanding group, and they had a couple big records, but they didn't become like the Jacksons. And I really believe it was because of them being associated with Curtime Records and that industry within Chicago. It was kind of dying out. But when the Jacksons hooked up with Berry Gordy, that put them on the national platform. You already know that when they hooked up with Motown, by that time they were transitioning, going out to California. So that regional element was important back then, because wherever you were at, it gave you an inspirational outlet, uh, possibilities to be able to get in the record business. Now, it's one thing to make records, but you got to go back to those venues that I spoke of, is because the Jacksons were performing at the Regal Theater. They were performing in all of these clubs where they were kids. They were 15 years old and under, where they were performing with whoever was the hot act that was coming into Chicago at the time. There's a poster, there's a flyer out there going back to around 67, 68. It's called the Battle of the Bands. And the Jackson Five are on that flyer with people who are 25, 30 years older than them. So that venue was there.
Yeah, and as we saw in the Jackson's American Dream and stories, they cut their teeth in the proving grounds of Gary and Chicago, and were well seasoned before they got their audition with Motown. And Barry Gordy was originally reluctant to sign them because of the hassle of going through with Stevie Wonder signing the Kid Act, because you got child labor laws and certain things you can and can't do with minors as far as hours go. But the audition, and of course Michael just won them over. And I want to talk about how when they got to Motown and they had the string of hits, the consecutive number ones, how tough was it, you think, for them to come into an operation where this is before we got the kid centric writers, producers, where at this time we had adults writing for kids. It was where it wasn't kids writing for kids, and we wouldn't see that later on. So, what do you think that sweet spot was with the production, songwriting team, the corporation, Norman Whitfield, everybody in Motown, the craft songs that were kid appropriate for these young kids who were going to take the pop and R&B world by storm?
Well, when you look at both sides, first of all, when you look at the Jackson Five, by the time they got to Motown, they were pros as far as being performers. They were seasoned pros as performers. They played at the Apollo. They would play like this again. Every other group, they already had a stage presence, and obviously they were still kind of raw in terms of recording because they hadn't made many records. But when you look in terms of what Motown was able to do, it speaks to the skill of writing, being able to write songs at a with a unique youthful slant. Of course, you got to put Barry Gordy into that mix because when they were initially creating songs for the Jackson Five, um, there's a guy who actually, I won't say he discovered them, but he was their first musical mentor. His name was Bobby Taylor, with a group called the Vancouvers, and he initially started recording them. If you go back and listen to their first four albums, in between all of those records that you hear that the corporation created, he was recording songs with them from a broader range. So he was actually grooming them to be a soul R&B group because he's got them doing Sly and Family Stone records. He's got them doing Walt Disney theme songs. He's got them doing Delphonics records. So a lot of those records that he's working with them over the course of that time period, because people don't realize is that when the Jackson Five went to Motown, they started recording. They just didn't start recording albums. They recorded a slew of songs that ended up being placed on a series of albums. And a lot of their best singing is on a lot of those songs that are on those Motown albums that they did. So when you look in terms of anything, the corporation did the pop hits, and of course, Barry Gordy is overseeing that. So when you look at, and he's a songwriter who's very in tune lyrically. And it goes back to the skill because he's like the project manager overseeing that. So when you look at the records like I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, Sugar Daddy, Mama's Pearl, just on and on, those records had the youthful slant, but those records were also bookended by a lot of traditional renditions of R&B records. The Jackson Five are doing renditions of songs in the Motown catalog recorded by the Four Tops. They're doing Standing in the Shadows of Love. They're doing Stevie Wonder's I Was Made to Love Her. Can You Remember? That's the Delphonics. But when you look at that time period, they were able, it's a testament to their talent. It's a testament to the coaching of Bobby Taylor. It's a testament to what Susan DePass brought to them. So again, these guys are coming into a space to where they have raw talent on the performance side, but they're in an umbrella where they have a lot of people working collectively to give them the great material to coach them on the vocal delivery, and of course, with them having the skill that they had. So I wouldn't say that it was hard. It's a testament to who they were as a group. And just like you said, they were the first young group that was out there. So when you look at anybody that was born between 1950, okay, and let's say 1965 going into 1970, the Jackson Five is their inspiration. You hear Eddie Murphy, who recently he won an award. He said, when I was coming up, the only people we saw on TV was Sidney Poitier and the Jackson Five. You listen to Lenny Kravitz. He said that when he was 8 years old in 1972, he went to Madison Square Garden to see the Jackson Five. Babyface, born 1954, 56 time period, talks about going to Market Square Arena in Indianapolis to see the Jackson Five. Oprah Winfrey, she had a crush on Jackie Jackson. So these people were born in the 1950s going into the mid 1960s. So there was nobody else out there in terms of a young black group for people to look at and be inspired by. So that's major during that time.
Yeah, definitely that. And you mentioned all of the songs that were written by the corporation that were popular. Of course, Never Can Say Goodbye, written by Clifton Davis, who would later go on to be a famous actor, and Amen. And prior to that, That's My Mama. And just how they really set the stage for what was to later come with a group of men, young men out of Boston and DC. New Edition just ramped up what the Jacksons did and just took it to a whole nother level and just blended in hip hop because they were a part of that first generation of kids to grow up on hip hop. Because to think about when Candy Girl came out in '83, a lot of people confused it with the Jacksons because of Ralph's voice being distinctive like Michael. And you got to give Maurice Starr credit for saying, hey, these guys won the audience over. I'm going to still sign them anyway. Put out these songs that are very Jackson 5 esque, but give it a hip hop spin to it.
But one of and that's true. And one of the common denominators that exists between the Jacksons and New Edition is this: when New Edition was um, competing, there was a talent show circuit in Boston, and during that time, because remember, this is 1980, 81, so you don't have, even though rap music is coming, there is no young music that's out there. So anybody that's born of a certain age group, you're taking your cues, your inspirational cues from older artists, and I'm in that same age group as them. So me growing up, anybody who's putting out music, they're 10, 15, 20 years older than me. So it's the same for them. So when they're out there performing in the vocal group lane, again, the reference is when you look at the continuum of black music, they are taking their cues from the stand-up vocal groups. If you look at the names that they had, I think it was the transition, whatever groups that they had, they identified
Transitions, the Untouchables.
that untouchables. Those names of vocal groups are birthed in the 60s and 70s vocal groups of that time period. So when you do the history of New Edition, they won a talent show when they're singing LTD's Holding On. And Holding On is a record that came out right around 1977, 78. But think about it. That means that the New Edition, they're 8, 9 years old when this record is coming out. So it's in their DNA. So they're performing in the same manner. The talent shows that they're doing in Boston is the same thing when the Jacksons are performing on Roosevelt High School in 1965 and they're performing the Temptations' My Girl. Or when you look at the Jacksons, that classic video footage they have when they're auditioning for Motown, and they're doing I Got the Feeling, and they're doing Ozzy Brothers records. So that's the thing people have to realize is that that's the power of black music, is that there was, even though the Jacksons were a reference for New Edition, but as far as the vocals and everything else, the Jackson Five, but their influence also comes from those 1970s vocal groups. They even Ronnie DeVoe even says, "Hey, if there's no Blue Magic, there is no New Edition," because that's who they're taking their cues from. I saw an Unsung episode where they were doing a dramatics episode on Unsung, and they had a member of Unsung, and they said, "Yeah, he's the Ronnie DeVoe of the group," and Ronnie DeVoe is in the episode. I think he's in the one for Blue Magic. So there's a DNA that exists.
Mhm.
In the absence of young music that's out there, you see that close comparison that exists. I mean, you're from the South, you're from North Carolina. So that whole, when people talk about the absence of black people not being able to play live instruments because the music disappeared from the schools, then think about the black bands that existed. There was no interruption. The black bands have continued. It never was a drop off in the HBCUs, which means that music was always there. And then the music that they're playing R&B music. They're playing R&B music of the past, which means that connection, it never was broken. So I wanted to kind of just throw that out there when we start looking at the arrival of young artists. So even though there are young artists coming, it's the music that they're doing initially is a younger interpretation of the music that they came up with or that they heard their parents play.
Right, because when we heard Candy Girl in '83, to hear that rap break, it was foreign because rap was still considered novelty and it's not the worldwide listened music that we know and love today. That it was
Mm-hmm.
alien, and if we look at the music industry at that time, still older, very bumpy, smooth, lush, adult. And I want to pivot that into the Luther Never Too Much documentary and how during the time when Luther was at his height, you had him, Sade, Whitney Houston, Aretha, Phyllis Hyman, Stephanie Mills, list goes on and on. And then with the emergence of the New Jack Swing sound that came in around 86, 87 with Full Force Work, and then of course Teddy Riley, everything that come after that, how R&B became more youth oriented and the beats were more aggressive and took on the personality and shape of hip hop. So what was it like for you being in the middle of that where you would listen to an R&B station, you would hear Luther Vandross, Whitney Houston, Sade, followed by Guy, Keith Sweat, I'll Be Sure, New Edition, and that style and sound of music was more hard, aggressive, in your face.
Okay, so growing up in the Midwest, I was exposed to everything that was out there. So you're talking about, because again, there was no young music, and even though rap music was out, it wasn't. Even though you had people playing it, they had the records. They might have played it here and there on radio stations or whatever, but it wasn't wide open. R&B music was still like dominant. So whoever was out, that means like Luther Vandross, because again, I'm born in 1968. Luther Vandross is born in 1951. So that's a 17-year difference. So anybody that's out making records at that time throughout the 80s, we're plugged into them. So what's happening is the younger people who are coming out, obviously ready for the world, the Janet Jacksons and people of that nature, that's like the undercurrent. So we were getting all of that music because there was no hip hop was still developing, and it kind of like the initial music was it kind of skewed older. So even though if you outside of New York, if you're listening to Curtis Blow, you're listening to whoever was out, Sugar Hill Gang, even though those records were out, right? They still had that type of R&B ish slant to it. So that means that older people, who might have been 6, 7 years older than me, they were buying those records not so much as for the MC content, but for the music content because those records were made in the vein of the popular music. So we heard everything, but obviously during that time you didn't have the peripheral media component. There was no source. There was no BET for a long time. So you just heard the music. You probably didn't even know what a lot of people look like, but it was a situation to where you're hearing this music and then you started to gradually see a change. I think, Janet Jackson, even when you look at New Edition, I'll just go back to them for a second. Even though New Edition were a young group, the songs were young, they had the young voices, their presentation was still like an old group because they wore the suits and the tuxedos and things of that nature. But it's still, when you heard the music and you saw them, it's still kind of slanted young. Janet Jackson was another milestone when you saw the music starting to slant young. Bobby Brown's first solo album. So you started to see a change. People don't realize when you look at Ready for the World, those guys were like at the time when they were making records, they were like 19 years old. So they were young. So gradually I saw the change when I left home in I think the summer of 87 to join the Air Force. And when I left home, the hot music of the time was the Minneapolis sound. We're talking about whether it was Prince, Alexander O'Neal, all that whole Minneapolis sound was just really killing it. Michael Jackson's Bad hadn't come out yet. Levert was out, but at the time, Levert's music was still it was slanted, still older. Casanova and everything that they had, pop, 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 goes my mind. But I remember going into basic training, and when I left basic training, about 3 or 4 months later, I went to see my sister in DC, and I was listening to the radio, and I was hearing Keith Sweat's "I Wanna," and I heard Kumo D's "How You Like Me Now," and it was just like all of a sudden you could hear the change. You could hear the change. But I was like, wow, this is different. You know, it was just different. And then that was late '87, and in '88, obviously, because again, we're talking about there's no BET is not covering these people. There are no Vibe. There's no source. Source is kind of new. So I'm starting to see in Spin Magazine, they're talking about this guy Teddy Riley and these records that he's producing. Now, mind you, we're just dealing with the Keith Sweat aspect of it, nothing else. And I'm thinking he's just yet another older producer producing records. But they just got the next thing you know, '88. It was like all of a sudden you start hearing about a slew of records. Now, mind you, for me, I'm in Hawaii in late '87, December '87, going into '88. So Hawaii doesn't have a heavy R&B presence. So I'm calling back home, writing back home, hey, what's the hot music out? And they're telling me that, I got my friend writing back to me, telling me this guy is Groove Me, is new, is Night and Day, it's Mama Sita, it's these records. And I had never heard these records. But then gradually people I know started, the records started appearing in the stores. So now you're hearing it, and then now it's starting to, everything's starting to come together. So even though in the rest of the states, people are hearing them and they're seeing the videos and all of that, I was a little late because I was in Hawaii and they didn't have that. But when I bought the records, it had just changed. It had just changed. I won't say, oh, it felt like it was changed overnight. So all of a sudden, when you start seeing the Bobby Browns and people that coming out now, even though Michael Jackson is probably 29 years old, but when you're seeing what Bobby Brown is doing and what Michael Jackson is doing, because think about it, it's only like a 6 or 7 or 8 month period between Bad and all of those New Jack Swing records. Those records are coming out like April, May of '88. Michael Jackson's Bad comes out like July '87. So we're talking about a year. So it's like everything that he's doing is almost like it's old. So that's when you started seeing the change of the music. But Luther Vandross was still huge. Anita Baker was still huge because their audience at the time, that was still the dominant artist. That was still the dominant audience. So if you were 30 years old, 25 years old, between 25 and 30 or older, that was the dominant R&B. So when you look at the charts, because this is before SoundScan, SoundScan didn't come out until '91. So that's why you still saw a dominant, um, you had a dominant presence of adult R&B music. You still had Jeffrey Osborne putting albums out up until '91. Freddie Jackson was doing his thing. Luther was doing his thing. Anita was doing her thing. Phyllis Hyman was still doing her thing. But the problem was that you saw a tier. So Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson, people like that, they set the bar. So if you were a R&B artist of that caliber making that same music, if you didn't hit that bar, it was like it was a tier. So Whitney and Michael were the tier, and the Regina Bells and all those other people, Phyllis Hyman, they were underneath. But by the time '89, '90 rolled around, it was like the nail was in the coffin for a lot of those artists. Luther still had the audience, and he was still selling platinum, double platinum, triple platinum, but the nail was on the nail was in the coffin for a lot of those groups and
Right.
artists.
Right, and then I want to go back to with the Teddy and Keith collaboration with Make It Last Forever, how Teddy was reluctant to do work on Keith because he was just solely focused on doing rap records with the work that he did with Classical 2, Rap's New Generation, Dougie Fresh, Slip Rick, the show, and the work with Kumo D, Go See the Doctor, and how I believe I read they recorded 16 to 17 cuts for Make It Last Forever, but only 9 ended up making the final cut. Just Got Paid was originally recorded for Make It Last Forever. It didn't make the cut. It ended up going to Johnny Kemp, and it became a massive crossover hit for him. And then years later on the No Strings Attached album, NSYNC covered that. But just how one man Teddy single-handedly changed the production of R&B by infusing the hip hop element. And like I mentioned, Full Force was the precursor of that with their own work. Their work with UTFO, Lisa and the Cult Jam, Cheryl Pepsi Riley. So you had those elements coming in, but it was Teddy that really kicked the door down.
And what it was, when you look at people like Full Force, even though they were making those street records, when they were making their own records, even though you started hearing the different drum beats and all of that, they were still they were kind of like in between their whole makeup. They were still like almost like a older version, because that was their influence. So when they're doing ballads and things of that nature, everything is still, they're kind of somewhere in the middle. Where they're kind of in the middle, where there's the younger, the new sound, but it's still slanting slightly older. But what it was that when Teddy's coming, he's changing the music. But what's happening is that the older sound is still dominant. And also got to remember is that the music industry is still revolving around people who are like 30 and 35 years old. They're in the end. These are the radio DJs. These are the record promoters and the people working within the music industry. So when Teddy's doing his music, it's kind of looked at like it's a new sound. But in those first couple years, it was kind of almost framed in a manner where it wasn't going to be around for a while. It was like the hot thing at that time, because again, you didn't have the outlets that were geared toward younger people. Younger people weren't in the media like that. They weren't in print media. You didn't have younger people in the visual mediums. You didn't have young people who were in the music industry like that. But the great thing about it is that at that time period, that 86, 87 time, rap music was now becoming the dominant youth music. Okay, where somebody before, if you were 16, 15, the Jackson 5, that was the space for you. Well, what happened was there were no R&B artists. That's why New Edition is so important, is because they basically cornered the market for a young R&B group, because there was nothing that was there. Now, they're the same ages of the Leverts, around that same age, but the Leverts, they were steeped in traditional R&B. So New Edition had that. They were kind of in, it was just them, and it was just rap groups, and it was just rap artists. So
Okay.
once rap music started to become dominant, it influenced the way people created music, because now live instrumentation is going out the window. Now all of that technology is becoming important. So you brought up Keith Sweat. Is that Keith Sweat is a little older, but Keith Sweat is steeped in the classic R&B of the time period, because by the time Keith's making his record, he's almost like 30 years old. He's like in his late 20s. So he's birthed. He looked up. Keith Sweat said that the person who he looked up to the most was James J.T. Taylor. He was trying to sing like him. That was his model. And of course, Keith Sweat is young enough to listen to the Blue Magics and the Ozzy Brothers or whatever, but he was young enough to see what was around the corner to hook up with Teddy and get those beats. But he did say in an interview, he was wondering, where do I fit? Because Alexander O'Neal was super hot, Luther was hot, this person was hot. So that young energy was really a saving grace for him, in
Yeah,
my opinion.
and I know he didn't want to sing in the nasal tone, but when you listen to his vocal stylings and you go back and listen to Steve Arrington from Slave, dead match.
Exactly. When you look at Keith Sweat's records, people talk about, the I Wannas, but if you listen to his albums, Keith Sweat had his records always had that groove. He had grooves, even though, a lot of it was the New Jack sound. He had grooves to the records. So when you go back and you listen to Steve Arrington, you go back and listen to Slave records, he has that bump. He has that bass. He has that groove, that mid tempo, that funk that's in his records or whatever, that he would just carry that over. So he was kind of in his own lane. But you're absolutely right, is that Keith Sweat comes along during a period where he continues the uniqueness of black male vocals, because there's a period of time where You had Sugarfoot for the Ohio Players. You had Larry Blackman. You had Larry Dodson. You had all these people with these unique. You could have a unique voice. You had the singers like Luther Vandross, Freddie Jackson, or whoever was making the traditional way of singing. But in R&B, still you could have a unique approach to singing that people. Roger Troutman was another one that you can listen to these people, and these people could have hits, and they were popular. So Keith Sweat comes along, even though Keith Sweat, his original vocal style, he sang in a falsetto. So if you go back and listen to Keith Sweat album he dropped in 2006, it's called Just Me. And Teddy Riley did a record, he produced a record for him that um Keith Sweat is kind of doing a loose remake of Blue Magic, What's Come Over Me, and he's singing the record in a falsetto. So but Keith Sweat, that nasal tone, that was a great idea because it made him unique.
Yep.
So and
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Gave him that calling card, and you mentioned the Minneapolis sound and Janet's Control. Now, some people say that was a New Jack Swing record, but when I look at the true definition of New Jack Swing, I wouldn't say that. I would say it was like the template because it had that same aggressive attitude of New
Mhm.
Jack Swing. Because when we look at Janet's first two albums, the self-titled album and Dream Street, they weren't bad albums done by Leon Silvers, who don't get enough credit for all the stuff that he did with Solar, and we'll talk about Solar in just a little bit, and that whole movement with him, the Calloway brothers, and then that was where LA and Babyface got cut their teeth, and that was started by Dick Griffey, and how when Janet got with Jam and Lewis, the smartest thing they could have done was convince Joe to say, "Hey, let her record this album in Minneapolis. Let's get her out of under daddy's thumb and let's create music for her that has her voice, her input." And then I also think Jamin Lewis's work with Climax kind of influenced their later work with Janet because they were able to see up front, okay, we got these ladies in here, attitude, don't take no mess. We're gonna apply that same energy to Janet.
Well, one of the things you got to look at, and those are some great examples that you provided. You got to give Jam and Lewis a lot of credit. And when it comes to the New Jack sound, first of all, Jam and Lewis, they're musicians. They're traditional musicians. So what they always said is that they were ahead of the curve with that type of sound. But they said the difference between what they were doing and what Teddy was doing is they just looked at it as a experimental sound that they would do, but they didn't do it on every single record. So it's a difference between how musicians, traditional musicians think. So when they're doing the heavy drum machines but they're still, if you listen to the Alexander O'Neal, the Janet Jackson albums, every song on that album does not have those heavy drum sounds. So their mentality is that we're going to use this technology to make these records. But our goal, we're not trying to have every record sound like that. So when you're a musician, your approach to making music is totally different. So you can hear different sounds and different type of things, and you can experiment with them, but you're not hanging your hat. And that's the difference between the producers who are coming before Teddy and the ones who are coming in Teddy's time and after Teddy, that everybody's kind of jumping on a similar sound. Because you also got to look at Jam and Lewis is that when they I won't say they introduced, but they utilized the TR-808 drum machine on a lot of their records. For example, when you look at the SOS band records, they're using the TR-808, and obviously Loose Ends was the first really R&B group to utilize the TR-808. Even though you look at Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing, he used the 808 drum machine on Sexual Healing. So that technology, Jam and Lewis took that and they created those sounds for SOS Band, and then using the different type of drum patterns and drum for Janet Jackson, to where now they're introducing a sound that exists for Janet Jackson. But the difference between what they're doing and what Teddy is doing, Teddy is incorporating the way rap music is created. So if you go back to the rap before records were made, they were doing routines. of records that were already out. So all of the groups that were doing before they made records, they had routines that were done to melodies of existing records during that period of time. So a general example is um, Kool Moe Dee and the Treacherous Three. They had a record called "Yes We Can," and the record is kind of like their rendition of the Pointer Sisters' "Yes We Can." Obviously, we know with Sugar Hill Gang, they're taking good times. So what Teddy was doing, he kind of continued in that same vein. So when you started looking at a lot of his productions, right after the Keith Sweat element, is that a lot of his productions are renditions. He's replaying and he's also sampling those records. He's replaying the record. So if you look at a record called like Today's Girl, I Got My Eye on You,
Hmm.
that's a Solar. That's based on a Solar record.
Yep.
Carrie Lucas, tell me where you're coming from. If you listen to the melody of My Prerogative, okay, everybody's talking. You go back and listen to Otis Redding's son. They had a group called the Reddings, had a song called Remote Control. You hear the same melody. When you listen to Just Got Paid that him and Keith Sweat made, go back and listen to Bell and James Living It Up on Friday Night, and you will hear similarities. So what's happening is when rap music is coming out, it's influencing how people are actually creating music. So even though Teddy's playing instruments, he's also now dipping into the sampling because he's the rap producer. So now when you look at the elements of New Jack, it's a different type of approach from what Jam and Lewis was doing. But also when you look at New Jack Swing, it's a different type of singing. Okay, because when you look at Luther Vandross and everyone else, when they're singing, they'll start off with a certain range, and then they'll gradually build up with the riffs and the whole drama. What New Jack Swing did, it took all the best elements of all music of the R&B musical styles, and they gutted out certain elements, and then they just use certain pieces. So when you listen to someone like Aaron Hall singing, and the Big Bubs and people like that, they're not singing the way Luther Vandross sings. So when they're doing all the riffing and the runs, and they call that melisma. When they're doing all the runs, normally if you listen to a traditional R&B record, they don't do that until the middle of the record, or they don't do it until the end of the record. But what was happening is these guys are doing it straight from the jump. And also a lot of songs that they're writing, remember, is that when you look at people like Smokey Robinson and people like that writing songs, it's based around the lyrics are very clever. You listen to the Motown records, the lyricism is very clever. It's very poetic. With the New Jack Swing, you don't have that. They're basically, and again, now you're seeing younger people writing songs, but they're not writing songs. They're not creating songs, creating music in the same vein that older people are. So when you listen to a record like Groove Me is kind of like almost a kind of in the vein of a funk record where you're just doing chants. And then you look at records like Piece of My Love, and just look at a lot of the New Jack Swing music that's coming out. If you just really listen to the lyrics, a lot of the music is kind of, the lyrics are not in the vein of what older people are doing. It's a younger person's approach to creating that music. And now we're young. So it's we hear it. So maybe our parents may hear records and they're like, well, man, what is he singing about? He's not really saying anything. But for us, how we hear music, it's in the same vein. It's kind of made for us.
Right, right. And with Jam and Lewis, I want to talk about what was it like for you hearing Heartbreak for the first time and the addition of Johnny Gill, and how, at least this is my opinion, with Jam and Lewis working with Alex, I think that kind of helped them on how to integrate Johnny into New Edition, and knowing that, okay, we got this new singer that's going to bring this new element to this group who's trying to figure out how do we transition from Candy Girl to let people know that we're mature young adults, but knowing that Ralph is the voice, the face, the front man of the group.
When you look at Jam and Lewis, and Terry Lewis is the guy who's the lyric writer. Okay. and Jimmy Jam obviously is the musician. So they're kind of like a modern day Gamble and Huff. But you got to understand is that, you know, you, their ability to create music goes back to their skill as younger people, what they're exposed to that came before them. So when you have a certain skill like that, the same way the corporation were able to write songs for the Jackson Five, they could actually do the exact same thing. And since you brought them up, it's very important. I'll use a comparison. Now, when you look at Usher's records, right? When Usher started making records with Jermaine Dupri, what would happen is that Usher was not a songwriter, but what Usher would do is Usher would have conversations with Jermaine Dupri. And from those conversations sprung songs. So they that's the method that Jam and Lewis did with Janet Jackson. They would have conversations with her, and from those conversations sprung compositions. New Edition, same situation is that with those guys, the music was there. So now it's all about updating their records. And I think that how they hooked up with Jam and Lewis, it was kind of almost by default because Jam and Lewis was the hottest production team that was out. They're coming off of they're coming off of Janet Jackson. They did, Tender Love, Force MDs. So they are the preeminent songwriters and producers during that time. But to their testament, they were able to create music for New Edition that was mature, but it was not like bubblegum. So if you look at the records that New Edition is doing, If It Isn't Love, Crucial, those records could have been made by anybody else. They're not too far from. You go back and listen to the SOS Band, from a lyrical standpoint, those songs are like they're still in the vein. It's still traditional R&B music, but what it is, it's coming from a younger group. But then now when Johnny comes along, obviously we know he takes them to the next level. But they were wise enough to say they understood that New Edition was already a brand. So they didn't want to, put Johnny on the leads because now the brand, you throwing people off. So when you hear records and you're hearing Johnny sing on these records, Johnny Gill was a younger artist, but he was making older people's music. Linda Creed and other people will create music for him. So for him to go out there and sing lead on those records, I really believe it would have just thrown the audience off. So if you've seen the interviews, he really is not involved on the leads, but the thing is Boys to Men
Mm-hmm.
is the record that he actually does. So that's their way of introducing him to within the scope of the New Edition brand. But I really believe that by him coming through New Edition, it kind of reignited his career because now once you saw them live, you saw them perform, and you saw the music videos. Anybody that's in my age group, if we remember Johnny Gill, we were like, okay, that's the guy with Stacey Lattisaw. So now it's like he has like a rebirth. He's rejuvenated. He's just a reintroduction. So it's like, when you got Coke, okay, and then you got cherry Coke and you got the different types. It's the exact same thing. So now they're just adding him to the brand, and then he was able to spring off and do his album. The first. Well, I would say it's the first album, but it's his third album that he's doing that has all the hits. So when you look at who's producing these records, it's LA and Babyface and it's Jam and Lewis. That team, they're the preeminent R&B producers of that time. You know.
Right, right. And it gave Johnny, a bigger profile boost because he had put out records prior to coming into New Edition, good records, but it kind of shows, once you get with people who can accentuate your skill set with songs and productions, it could take it to a whole nother level. And what a lot of people do or do not know, Don't Be Cruel was also released by MCA on the same day as Heartbreak. Now, I had this conversation with a friend of mine on Facebook. We were talking about Girlfriend off of King of Stage for Bobby, and how I felt like it was risky for MCA to release Girlfriend as the lead single because ballads, you typically would release them as maybe second or third single, but not your lead. And once you heard the title track off of King of Stage with the more gritty, aggressive hip hop sound with Mixmaster Ice from UTFO cutting and scratching, you kind of heard he figured out what he wanted to do as a solo artist to differentiate himself as being Bobby Brown from New Edition. Because me personally, I felt like Girlfriend, Spending Time, those records were MCA's way of holding on to New Edition Bobby image and sound. Whereas when he hooked up with LA and Babyface with Don't Be Cruel, he figured it out.
But remember too is that when Bobby Brown puts that record out, that record comes out in 1986. So it's kind of a space to where the record is created in the same vein of Janet Jackson's album, the Janet Jackson album, and Janet Jackson's Dream Street. Is the album kind of follows the trend of R&B records where you have a hodgepodge of producers and there isn't necessarily a uniform sound. You know, you just got different type of producers with different styles, and there's just a mix of the different styles on the album. So when you listen to King of Stage, and I remember buying the cassette when it had come out, Girlfriend was a number 1 record for him. And it was, but what it did was it was clever for them to do it. Because remember, this is like 3 years because Bobby is known for Is This the End? You know, when he's singing those ballads. So it's a continuation of that. And the record was extremely popular. And of course, when he did Girl Next Door, you know, Larry Blackman is producing it. And at that time, Larry Blackman is super hot because at the time Larry Blackman is doing this, you know, Cameo was like super, super big at then, you know, with the Word Up album and everything else. So it's more about, okay, we're going to get this person and this person. And at that point, uh, you know, when you look at LA and Babyface, they were producing records. And at that time, Babyface was in the process of recording or dropping his very first album. They were still on Solar Records. So Babyface, LA and Babyface hadn't really stepped into that vein. I think the if you look at R&B producers during that time, the Calloway brothers were kind of bubbling, doing their thing because this is, you know, Casanova's coming after that. But you don't have a singular. I mean, you got talented producers out there, but you know, you don't have that singular producer that's going to go ahead and drive that sound. But what it is, like you said, is that it's almost like he's doing Girlfriend and he's doing Girl Next Door, but and then Spend Time. I think Larry White might have done that record. So when you look at everything underneath that, when he's rapping and he's doing the King of Stage song, that's the vein of the music that he wants to do. But you got to give MCA credit. You got to give Gerald Busby and especially Lou Silas, you know, credit to look at. Hey, you know what? There's another chamber in there, but also you got to give MCA a credit for them spending money on these producers. You know, to say, you know what, we're going to go ahead and invest in these top-notch producers to go ahead. So by the time they get LA and Babyface to do the Bobby Brown records, these guys are killing it. You know, the Whispers, Rocksteady they got that. They've got, you know, Pebbles. They got, you know, just these guys they're there, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So it's a testament. But really, if you look at them, they are the dominant producers on the record. It's like, okay, we're gonna get Teddy Riley to do it. He does a couple records, but it's clear that LA and Babyface are the high profile producers. But what it is that my prerogative is like the centerpiece of the record because it represents that new sound. Even though LA and Babyface are doing their thing, my prerogative is like that new sound that drives the record. Because think about it, when my prerogative comes out, it's super huge. And then when every little step comes out, when they remix it, they're remixing it in a new jack swing style in 88, 89, because now it's clear that's the dominant sound that's out. So if you don't have Teddy Riley, obviously you could possibly have a Bobby Brown or Johnny Gill making records like Freddie Jackson or Luther Vandross singing like that. You know, so I
Mm-hmm.
just think that the timing was very important, and MCA being able, they were heavily vested in black music at that particular time. So that was great. If Bobby Brown was on A&M Records or Capitol Records, he would not be the one, you know. So it was just timing, people, right place, right time.
Right. And let's talk about Solar. And just to get a little bit of backstory, Solar was originally Soul Train Records, a partnership
Mm-hmm.
with Don Cornelius and Dick Griffey. They put out the Soul Train Gang. And then Don Cornelius said, "This is too much for me. I'm going to back out, just solely focus on the show." And Dick Griffey took over, rebranded it as Solar. And that's where we had Dynasty, Shalimar. We mentioned the Calloway brothers, and that was where Ellie and Babyface cut their teeth. So can we just talk about Solar and just how that whole movement doesn't get enough credit? And also, it was the label that kind of started the seed for what later became Death Row. Because I believe they worked out of the building where Solar worked at, I believe.
Yeah, Solar Records was really dope because their lane, they were doing obviously, you know, the sound of Los Angeles Records. That's an offshoot of the whole sound of Philadelphia. You know, everybody's doing that. You know, LJ's had their own small label, Sound of Cleveland. Solar was dope because they were unique because the musicians on the records, they were also the artists. So when you go back and listen to those records, you got people from Lakeside and Dynasty and all of those Solar groups. They're performing on these people's records on the music side, so they were self-contained. So if you look at the credits, you'll see guys from Lakeside who helped write those records along with Leon Silver. So they were kind of in-house. Solar had this very slick sound. The music was very melodic. It was very catchy. And you got to realize the music was so good that when you look at somebody like the Whispers are a stand-up vocal group. So by the time, the Whispers had been out, probably for about a good 10 years making records, by the time they got down with 8 to 10 years before they got down with Solar. And the unique thing is they were the flagship group. They were the centerpiece. But if you look at the records that they were making, the up-tempo records, that kind of kept them in the vein of what was out at that particular time, all the up-tempo dance-oriented records, because in that period, 78, 79, 80, 81, the stand-up vocal group with the matching suits, they play it out. They're done. But the Whispers was the only ones out there, 80, 81, 82, 83, mid-80s, that was still out there representing for those groups, but they had that, it was the dance music. So when you look at, again, Lakeside, you got Midnight Star is coming through. Everybody is kind of like, it's kind of like a self-contained sound, you know, and that's very, very important. And you don't get a lot, you don't talk about Solar enough and look at what Leon Silvers was able to do as a producer. But I think probably is that because they made R&B records that really just lent itself to black music. They weren't pop records. They kind of ignored. They're like a footnote, because when we look at artists, now everything is all branding. Everything is branding and image and all of that. But when you look at what from a period, I would say maybe from 78 till about 83, 84, you talking about like Leon Silvers was the man. He was the man. He kept the lights on for them guys, but there were other people who were collaborating with him musically, but he was the in-house producer for Solar, and he was really good. But think about it. You got Shalimar. They had great records. Again, I talked about Lakeside, and these guys, Lakeside, they kind of like, they did their own music. It was in-house. They wrote and produced their own songs. Shalimar, again, they benefited from all those other acts who wrote and produced or whatever, but there was a visual appeal to these groups, but it's just the music was so great. But what happened was it kind of like changed. I don't know if you've ever saw an Evelyn Champagne King record to where she kind of moved away from, she tried to do a Leon Silvers record. After she worked with Kashif, she tried to do a Leon Silvers record in 84, 85, but by that time, the music had kind of like played itself out, and that whole Minneapolis sound was coming through.
Mm.
But that slick sound, I'm trying to tell you, man, those records were great.
Yeah, you mentioned Kashif, and I want to talk about Hush and how that whole movement I feel does not get enough credit for what they brought to R&B. You know, I had the pleasure of interviewing with Lilo Thomas and just talking about how him, Freddie Jackson, Melissa Morgan, Melba Moore, Paul Lawrence, Kashif, Hush, they were the truth. And I believe, you know, had they would have had a little bit more pop exposure, they would have had that breakout success, because I feel with Freddie, it was almost where Luther pretty much cornered that market.
Well, when you look at Hush Productions was dope because Hush Production was it was their sound was like it was New York. You know, they didn't have the Philly sound with the strings. They kind of incorporated the technology, but the sound was it was urbane. It was very slick. It was for that time period. So if you were a black person, you know, that was like 30 years old, 35 years old, you know, during that period of time, it was a certain type of music that you listened to. It was smooth, it was urbane, it was slick. And they weren't trying to make pop records. But what happened was it had the ear of the public because Melba Moore was putting out records that were like number one. You know, Freddie Jackson was doing his thing, and people don't realize Freddie Jackson was dominant. Freddie, you're talking about a period of time between 1985 to about 1991. Every single that Freddie Jackson put out, it was either number one or number two. He had almost seven number one records in a row. Freddie Jackson was owning radio, and at that period of time, Luther was popular, but Freddie was coming with that sound, and they had the drum machines and all of that. But it's just that when you look at Hush Productions, you know, a lot of things going on depending on who you talk to regarding their business. But they had relationships with Capitol Records, you know, and it's just one of those type of things that the partnership, the distribution, the business issues that go on that they didn't have that would break them pop. But they didn't necessarily need to be pop. These guys were like Lilo Thomas was extremely popular, you know, for that audience. Once again, that is like 40 and under, 30 and 40 years old. That was their audience. It's just the fact that R&B music was always this secondary thing.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned with Kashif, rest in peace, and how, you know, You Get Good Love, produced by him, written by Lala,
Mhm.
was the debut record that set it off for Whitney, and how that debut album gave Clive the green light, was like, okay, we got this artist here. We can work one song across multiple formats. And once, I believe, once he saw that, okay, pop, 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 the 86 album was definitely leaning in the pop direction. Then, of course, that led to her getting booed at the Soul Train Awards, where her music was deemed okay. She's appealing to the suburbs. And then that's when Clive went and called Ellie and Face and said, "We need to get the R&B audience back." So that's why they got them for the "I'm Your Baby Tonight" album.
Well, the thing is, during that period of time, that 86, 87 period was very interesting for black music. And the reason why I say that is that starting, you know, you familiar with what they call the British invasion. You know, starting
Mm-hmm.
in the early 80s, you started seeing a lot of it was almost the second British invasion compared to
Yeah.
the one from the 60s, but you saw a lot of British acts that were coming out, and they were doing some of their music was like a rendition of black music. Like there was a group called Katrina and the Waves, and they had a record called Walking on Sunshine, and and it had the same production style as an old Motown record. You had Phil Collins doing "You Can't Hurry Love." You had ABC doing "When Smokey Sings." So you had, and then Boy George was coming out, and he was doing his version of reggae records, like "Do You Want to Hurt Me?" You know. So
Mm-hmm.
what it is that those now when videos are coming out, these artists are now getting on MTV, and a lot of the records that they're inspired by, they're doing their version of those records. And during that time period, you didn't have a lot of black acts that were getting a lot of pop airplay, but then you saw like the Whitney Houstons that were coming along, but the people who were before them, the Bobby Womacs and all them, they were like dead in the water because there was no space for them. Because disco moved them out, but then when R&B started to go into this pop space, you didn't, it was very hard for them to transition. So even though you got a guy like Bobby Womack that got a record called um If You Think You're Lonely Now, which was a huge record in the black community, all of those artists, they weren't going to have pop exposure. So they were regulated to R&B, which meant their budgets were going to be R&B. They didn't have a platform to showcase. But all of a sudden you have all these British acts, you have all these American pop acts, the George Michaels, everybody's doing their version of black music and they're winning the awards. They're doing all of these different type of things. So then what's happening is that the black audience, they're becoming extremely sensitive to that, to where now anybody that's coming out with pop oriented music, they're kind of looking at them like very skeptical. So when Whitney Houston is coming out with "You Give Love," keep in mind they Clive Davis was, I'm going to break her to the R&B audience first. So "You Give Good Love" is in the vein of the Freddie Jackson, the Nita Baker-ish, that would come, that traditional Quiet Storm R&B. But once that record broke, that record was the setup for what was going to come next. So every other record now was going to be a pop record, and that's because that was his goal. I'm all about breaking pop artists. When you look at Clive Davis comes from the school of when you had vocalists before we got so preoccupied with I want to write my own songs. He comes from an era where there were he what producers would do, or record company people would do, they would look for songs, or they would look for songwriters, with established records. He did it the old school way. I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking for songs. And that's the thing. I'm looking for a certain type of song. It wasn't like, okay, we're going to have her write her own records. He was curating compositions and producers the way that was the old way before people started writing their own music. People were preoccupied with that. So her records now started to become a pop slant. So it was one thing for her to do uh You Give Good Love, and it's another thing to do um The Greatest Love of All, because we know The Greatest Love of All, that's a remake. So in black people, that's in their DNA. So then the next thing you know, when she comes out with the next album, where I Want to Dance was 87, people are kind of turned off because at this point, you go from this to this. And
Mm-hmm.
again, the music, the undertone is you also got the younger music that's coming out. So she's kind of caught because now she's in this pop space, kind of the R&B records that she was doing. Not so much of that. And then, of course, you got New Jack Swing that's there. So, like you said, Clive Davis went and got uh, LA and Face to kind of like toughen up her sound. So when you see Whitney Houston, she's sitting on the motorcycle. That whole, it's like a spoke car edgy look on her album cover. So she's got those pop ballads, but she has, it's more of an R&B slant. And that album, I'm Your Baby Tonight, it kind of, there's some good songs on there, but people have kind of forgotten about that album. That album kind of sits, it kind of fell through the cracks. It sold what it sold, but that first album, second album, and then the albums that would come after that, My Love Is Your Love, it got kind of overshadowed. But you're absolutely right. That's exactly what they did.
Right, and you mentioned Greatest Love of All, which was Whitney covered. It was originally done by George Benson, and I don't know if you saw the Yacht Rock documentary and how they talked about during that period how black artists that were out had to pivot because I grew up knowing George Benson as a singer first because I first heard Turn Your Love Around all the later cuts, but going back and listening to just the instrumentalist, I think he had said in his Questlove Supreme interview that This Masquerade was the first record that he ever sang on, and then how artists like him, Brenda Russell, Ray Parker Jr. with radio and later his solo success during that period, almost like, okay, we're gonna make music that's gonna go this lane, and if it gets accepted here, fine. If not, then yeah, because Ray Parker Jr. radio, they had that sound that appealed to AC, what would now be AC, R&B, and could work various formats. Then of course, when Ghostbusters hits, that was like the one song for Ray Parker Jr. That's the lottery ticket that you cash in. And then for those that don't know, Mr. Telephone Man was originally recorded by an artist by the name of Junior Tucker. And then Ray Parker Jr., I guess, when he saw New Edition, whatever, like, let me try this song on New Edition. And it became a bigger hit on New Edition as it was originally for Junior Tucker.
His style of songwriting. You can you hear me? I know your
Yeah, I can
screen
hear you.
froze up a
Yeah, I
little
can hear
bit.
you. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I can hear you.
What Ray Parker Jr. kind of was like Chuck Berry in a way that, like, Chuck Berry back in the 50s, he wrote songs. He was an older man. And Chuck Berry used to write songs the way the corporation would write songs for the Jackson Five. He was writing them with a youthful slant. Ray Parker Jr. was in that same vein, and he was a guitarist, but he knew how to write simple and catchy lyrics to where radio, he wrote all those songs. He wrote and produced all the records. But because he wasn't confident in his singing, he got those other members that were actually there. He had them on salary. So he kind of was like a Prince, doing what Prince was doing in the same vein in terms of writing and producing. He had his own studio at the time. So when he's writing and producing records, his songs are getting a lot of pop airplay. Records like Bad Boy. There's a record that he made, I'm in Love with the Other Woman, just kind of catchy records, you know. Um, and he was kind of like the precursor to like Joe. So if you go back and listen to Ray Parker Jr.'s records, he always had these cautionary records about uh, relationships, how if you don't take care of your girl or your woman or whatever, you're gonna lose her. You know how like Joe had those same records?
Mm-hmm.
Ray Parker Jr. had those records first. If you go back and listen to songs in his catalog, but again, he had that pop feel with the records because he could do funky records on his album, but his singles were like pop records and they were really going, they were moving on to the pop charts. So, and we're talking about 82, 81, 82, 83, and obviously, Ghostbusters doing this thing. So they don't talk about him enough as far as that whole black pop thing that was going on in the mid 80s. He was kind of like leading that. But when you look at going back to Whitney Houston, that was the lane that Clive was pushing her in. He was trying to do that to Phyllis Hyman, but Phyllis Hyman pushed back. So Phyllis Hyman was like his first time dealing with a female R&B artist. And when you look at what Phyllis Hyman could do, if you go back and listen to records that she had, like Somewhere in My Lifetime or other records, she had Barry Manilow writing records for her. But it just so happened was those records didn't. She was a few years before her time to where those records were pop records, but they really didn't catch on. So she was almost like the guinea pig for Clive Davis, but because she wasn't in alignment with what he was doing with her career, he kind of like threw her away.
Yeah, she was one of the artists that I felt labels didn't know what to do with because she could go any genre with her voice. I mean, to listen to her sing a Burger King commercial jingle about a Whopper, I never wanted a Whopper so bad after listening to her jingle. And then, of course, Luther also cut his teeth singing jingles as well.
When you look at Phyllis Hyman could sing torch songs, she could sing jazz, she could sing R&B ballads, quiet storm ballads, she could sing up-tempo records. And then think about it, also long before Deborah Cox, long before Tony Braxton and all these people, Jennifer Hudson, were going on Broadway. Phyllis Hyman was going on Broadway, but at the time, it wasn't like it wasn't common. Like Clive Davis didn't want her to go on Broadway. So the avenues that it would exist for female vocalists later, she came along at a time where it wasn't as celebrated to do multiple things. So she didn't have the avenue. And that was a thing. And she didn't get the respect within the industry for her talent. So now, by the time, she's doing her thing, but now you're seeing a younger group of people that's coming out, and that caused a lot of stress for her, and that contributed to her committing suicide because you look around and you have this talent, but you're either not paid for your talent or the outlets that you have. She's not on MTV. She's not on different video outlets. So now, it creates a lot of stress, and we know what happened with her
Hmm.
tragically. But,
Yeah.
you know, that's the thing. And Whitney Houston, when you look at that, it parallels it because Whitney Houston was caught between the pop and the R&B thing, and people kind of turned their back on her for a while.
Hmm. Yeah, because like when you listen to Mary J. Blige and the What's the 411 album, you could clearly hear, it sounds like something Whitney would have done because it had that street edge, that hard sound. And Whitney's from Jersey.
But Clive Davis was not. He was looking at her, to his credit, and that how he positioned her gave her a lot of longevity. But you got to realize, like you said, is that by the time she's doing I'm Your Baby Tonight, you know, the year after that, now you got hip hop soul coming in. But what saves her, she's doing The Bodyguard, and The Bodyguard is super huge. Then she's doing the soundtracks are helping her because she's not doing those soundtracks. If Whitney Houston's not doing the Bodyguard soundtrack, Waiting to Exhale, those are a
Hmm.
bridge to carry her over into the next era of music. So if those soundtracks don't exist,
Hmm.
it could be a situation where after Whitney Houston does that I'm Your Baby Tonight, that's it for her. Just the kind of way
Right.
Freddie Jackson died out,
Hmm.
Whitney Houston could have died out because
Right.
that whole hip hop soul comes in. And since you brought that up, hip hop soul changes the game too because now it further edges out musicians and it's strictly about the production when it comes to sampling. And then it kind of like now the younger audiences are we're there. We're locked
Right.
in. Now you're starting to see younger people in the music business. So anybody who was of a certain age, they still could be young. They could be like 32, 33, 34, maybe 35 or whatever. But we're looking at these people like they're old.
Right.
That's why when you see Michael Jackson, well, Michael Jackson does Bad, great album. But the next year, when Bobby does Don't Be Cruel, the Bad album sounds very dated.
Right. Right. Definitely did because when the Jacksons put out the 2300 Jackson Street album, they had Teddy do She, and I believe Randy was singing lead on that record.
He did. He
Epic
sang
messed
lead.
up by not releasing that as a single, and I think Michael probably heard that and said, let me try to link up with Teddy. And then, like you said, he also recognized the work that I had with Quincy Jones, RIP, was becoming stale and considered outdated. So let me link up with this young up and comer that's going to keep my sound fresh.
And there's a lot of stories with that because there's one story that where Quincy was like, hey, we've gone as far as you can go. And now you need to kind of go, with Teddy. And then Teddy talks about how he was supposed to work with Michael Jackson early on, around that Bad era, but Gene Griffin was like, nah, because he didn't want Quincy to steal Teddy away because Gene Griffin had the grip on him. And then, but one of the things that Michael Jackson was always doing is he had his ear to the ground and he would work with people. And this is that during that time period, he worked with Ellie and Babyface, but he didn't use their material. Michael Jackson's notorious for that. He can work with different producers and stuff like that, but the music never comes out or whatever. Because even though Michael Jackson, you're dealing with, Teddy, that really kind of took him to the next level. But Michael Jackson was known for that. So before he
Right.
was even dealing with Teddy, he was dealing with other people. So even still, when you look at what he was doing leading up to the Invincible album, he's working with a variety of producers, but the music is never coming out. You
Right.
know, yeah.
Right. And you mentioned hip hop soul, how that changed the game. And then talking about Whitney's situation, Mariah's was kind of similar to that, where when she first came out with the debut album, the Emotions album, it was clear Tommy Mottola and everybody else involved was like pop, 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 pop. She was on R&B radio, but it was clear pop, 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 pop. But then once it got to the Music Box album and Butterfly, she started to say, okay, I'm going to fully go head first into R&B and hip hop and do the remixes with JD. And I think that really branched her out. And of course, she wrote most of her stuff as well.
That saved her, in my opinion, because they were really positioning her, as I won't say as a response to Whitney Houston, but I do remember When she came out with Vision of Love in 1991, that was the big thing in terms of the people were like, wow, this is like she's next. She's gonna be like the next Whitney Houston. And also when they were marketing uh Mariah Carey, we know now when you look at Mariah Carey's background is that her father was black and then her mother was whatever the nationality that she was, but they were marketing um Mariah Carey as this racially ambiguous artist. So when they would ask her, and I'm half Argentinian, I'm this, I'm that, and they were kind of like she was almost that was their version of a Whitney Houston, but they were really marketing her as a pop artist. Remember earlier in our conversation, I talked about age was very important in music. Mariah Carey was 33 when
So,
Mariah Carey was even though she was doing pop records in the vein of what Whitney Houston was doing, there is a 7 year difference, age difference between her and Whitney Houston. So even though Whitney Houston is birthed in gospel, she's doing R&B music. She's coming from the pedigree. Her mom, Sissy Houston, she's doing the pop records. Mariah Carey is doing these records, but at a certain point, remember, Mariah Carey is a year older than Mary J. Blige. So even though she's making these pop records, her ear is attuned to all of the hip hop and R&B and the rap music that's out. So it's not a stretch for her to venture into that space. And like you said, when the Music Box album came out, that was a seamless transition. So when Dave Jam Hall is working with her, now that's the transition. And she still got the big pop records. But then that transition is solidified once she goes ahead and she starts getting Jermaine Dupri and Bad Boy to start producing her.
hmm
And what that does, that extends her career because now she's still doing Always Be My Baby and all those pop records, but she's doing R&B hip hop records with the slant where they're sampling records, and so she's in that vein and she doesn't miss a beat. And when she's doing the records, it doesn't look like, okay, she's pandering to the hip hop R&B crowd like it's a stretch. It's a seamless transition. So by the time Whitney does it. She's doing My Love Is Your Love with Wyclef, and those are R&B records. But when she gets into the vein, we're talking about like 2001, just one of those days where she's doing the Ron Ozzy sample Between the Sheets. That's a dope record, but it's a little bit too late. It's a
hmm
little bit too late. And she's trying to adapt. But Clive Davis is like, he's pushing her to do the pop records. Because remember, at the time, after the success of all those albums, My Love Is Your Love and everything that came before that, Whitney Houston signs this $100 million deal with Arista Records. At the time, L.A. Reid is running the label. Whitney Houston don't put out an album. She puts out just one of those days. That's on like a greatest hits of the album of the song she put out from 80 84 all the way up into like 2000. So just one of those days was just a single that was on the greatest hits. But think about it, Whitney Houston doesn't put out any more albums until the last album she put out before she died.
hmm
So her thing was she was just kind of caught up in the space where I don't think she ever recovered. That was that was an issue to where people love you and then they boo you and they're making fun of you. And of course, we know what's going on in the personal life. And I just think she never really recovered from that. Where Mariah Carey, she almost fell into that lane because right around the time of the Glitter album, she had her issues, but she was able to recover and keep things going. So there's similarities between those two in terms of the type of music they made, what they went through behind the scenes in the industry. But Mariah Carey is able to kind of continue,
Right.
you know.
I agree. What was your take when you first heard and saw Troop? Because for me, they're my number two group. New Edition is one, and they were held as the West Coast New Edition, R.I.P. Reggie Warren.
When I heard, I somebody told me about them before I heard them. Okay, because again, I am still I'm in Hawaii, so there is no BET in Hawaii. There is no urban outlet to where you can see these people. So you're hearing the records, and then the records are out. You're buying them, and whatnot. You're hearing them, but it is not between until Arsenio Hall show comes out, and now we're able to see, and he's major because now you have the records, and then of course BET's coming out, and then you can see him on BET. But I never saw them. I saw them perform on Soul Train. I think when they might have done Mamacita or whatever. But when they started doing records like Spread My Wings and Attitude, and now they're on Arsenio Hall. So you see the visual aspect of it that was very, very good. I think that they were unique where they had a voice that was a centerpiece, Steve Russell. And of course, they had Allen, so they could kind of like switch off. It was kind of like when you see the Bobby Brown, Ralph Tresvant, Johnny Gitt, these people, they had a couple signature voices or whatever. So it was they were in the same vein like that, to where they had those voices, and obviously Ralph was the dominant voice, where like Steve was the dominant voice, and they were exciting to see. They were kind of like they were the West Coast New Edition, but they had more of a street dance element, more acrobatic. New Edition was still grounded in the old school way of the stepping choreography. These guys, and that's what separated Troop from New Edition. They could step, but they also incorporated a lot of the dances that were out in their music. Don't get me wrong, New Edition, you saw them do it to a certain degree when they were performing records like Crucial on the Soul Train Awards, but their thing was they were kind of in that vein of the choreography, the stepping choreography, where Troop was more of a freestyle aspect of it.
Yeah, because when you look at the dancing aspect, like you mentioned, Troop from the West Coast, Pasadena, influenced by locking, waving, the whole movement done by the Lockers with Tony Basil, Shabadoo, Rerun, what we saw on Soul Train. Because when you dancing out on the West Coast, it's totally different than dancing any other part of the country. And then New Edition had that traditional dancing of the Temptations, Stylistics, Shy Lights, Blue Magic, because that's the school Brooke Payne comes from, Charlie Atkins, legendary Motown choreographer, give you that traditional male group feel, while Troop has that more hip hop aesthetic. And the lead single off of their debut album in '88, Mamacita, was produced by Mark Gordon and Gerald Levert of Levert. And we mentioned Levert earlier, and how even though they were young, they skew older because, of course, with Eddie Levert, Sean Levert's dad, being Eddie Levert of the OJs, and how when I interviewed Mark Gordon, I was telling him, like, Levert's music pretty much sounded like what the OJs would sound like with a youthful edge. Because Casanova, as we mentioned earlier, big pop hit for Levert, only pop hit for him off of the Big Throwdown, but every other record after that was R&B hit. And then of course Gerald's success as a solo artist, him doing work on Rude Boys, and then he really achieved pop success when he linked up with Keith Sweat and Johnny Gill to form the supergroup LSG.
Well, when you just to double back for 1 second, when you talked about the dancing with Troop, what people don't realize is that in the 80s, in the like the mid to especially going into the late 80s, there was this dance scene in California to where there were clubs that young people could go to, and they had dance groups. And we're not talking about hip hop dance groups, but they would do routines and things like that. You're talking about, as early as 83, 84. There was a younger current of teenagers to where they had teen clubs, and people had these different type of dance routines and things of that nature. And that was extremely popular. So when you look in terms of what Belle Biv DeVoe was doing, when they were in the New Editions hanging out in these clubs, they're seeing groups like there's a female group called Straight Ahead that they pulled them out of that, and that whole Poison choreography, that the dancers, those female dancers, they come out of the clubs. When you look at the Heart and Soul, you know, the dance club component, we know about on the New York side with the freestyle dancers. You've heard about the IOU dancers and people like that was in the clubs in the 80s, Latin Quarter and all that. But in California, they also had their scene. So when you look at the dances that Bobby Brown had with him, Heart and Soul, these guys came out in California. They came from California. So that dance element with Troop, it's not a stretch. It's birthed in that style in terms of that. So when you start seeing their presentation, and of course, the popping, the locking, and the waving, they're doing their thing. And of course, we know New Edition in '83, they were kind of doing Popcorn Love. They were doing the popping and all that stuff like that. But their stage show kind of like smoothed out to where it was old school. Now, when you talk about Gerald Levert and Levert, like you said, they were birthed in the traditional R&B. Because remember, there are no young groups that are out there. So they are doing a younger version of what the OJs is doing. Also, the music that they're creating is in the same vein of that. But then also when you start looking at Gerald Levert, the Levert albums that they're coming out, whether you're looking at um the album they did, what's the album that they did after the Big Throwdown? It's the
Just
one that had
cooling.
Pullover, Just Coolin'. They did Just Coolin'. You look at For Real Though, and then they had an album in between,
Rope a dope style.
Rope It Up Style. So if you listen to those albums, you see they're him and Mark Gordon are doing a variation of whatever the style is out. So when you look at Just Coolin', they're doing their version of New Jack Swing. When you look at when they're doing Rope A Dope Style, they got a song called Nobody Does It Better on there, and you hear uh their version, they're doing their version of a Poison record. So you see them incorporating that, but the records they're getting hits on are the Baby I'm Ready, all the ballads. That's what they're known for. Even though they're doing those up-tempo records, their hits are primarily the traditional R&B. And at a certain point, they kind of like Mark Gordon and the Gerald Levert, they kind of go in different creative directions to where Mark Gordon is staying in that vein. So when you look at the last album that they did before they broke up, that came out in '97, uh, you see Mark Gordon doing records like Teddy Riley. He got his version of No Diggity. He's got Missy Elliott on the record, so he's still in the hip hop R&B lane. But when you look at Gerald Levert, he's doing what he's doing. There's a song on there like it's called Like Water. So Gerald Levert is going into that space. He's still staying in the traditional R&B that he never moved away from. So you see that there's a creative conflict between those guys, the way they
Right.
go in a separate direction.
Right, right. And let's talk about Maurice Starr and how we mentioned him earlier and how the Hollywood Talent Night at the Strand Theater in Boston in 8081, that was the show that led him to give New Edition their deal even after not placing first in the talent show. And then 3 years later, after the split with them, after they left Streetwise to go to MCA, he said, I'm going to take this, put it on Five White Kids, and create the world's biggest pop group. And just to think about how a black man created the world's biggest pop group and set the stage for all the boy bands to come after them from 98 Degrees, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, O Town, and then with him giving New Edition the deal to record Candy Girl, no New Edition, no Boys to Men, none of that, and how Maurice Starr had his hands in both of those groups' careers, to where they both have
Well,
stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and everything.
see, another thing is the boy band aspect of it. I try to disassociate the black artists from the boy band concept. I'm not trying to be racial here, but the boy band concept is a white pop concept because everybody they like to call the Jackson Five a boy band, and they're not a boy band. When you look at I'm going back to them briefly. When you look at the Jackson Five, They are a combination of, you see them when they were younger. They're a combination of the Temptations. They're a combination of Sly and the Family Stone. If you ever saw the whole makeup of Sly and the Family Stone, and then they're a combination of James Brown. So these guys are in that vein, but when you see their presentation, they are dancing. They got people playing instruments. So they are a literal band. They are an R&B group, to the point that they're so huge that they never had to open up for anybody. They went straight from making records to going to Madison Square Garden to where the Commodores are opening up for them. So they were never a boy band. New Edition was never a boy band. New Edition, again, they're in the vein of, like I said, the Blue Magics and everybody else is coming, to Jacksons. They coming. That's the vein. They continue that tradition. The boy band concept comes now later. Now, when you look at what Maurice White is doing, he's doing what basically that model, he did it in reverse, to where there was a period of time in the 50s and the 60s, specifically in the 50s, that when black groups would come out with R&B records, their records were covered by white artists. So whether it would be uh, people like Little Richard, people like Laverne Baker, people like um, the Flamingos, you know, in the 50s. Now you got people like Pat Boone, the McGuire sisters, and Elvis Presley in the 50s remaking these people's records. And now the records are bigger on the pop charts. Bobby Womack comes out with a record. The Rolling Stones come out with the cover. It becomes super huge. So back then, you had white artists who were covering the black records. Move fast forward to the 80s. You got Michael Bolton, who's actually covering Motown records, and he's becoming a big artist doing his version of black music. You got George Michael, same situation. So that model always existed. So what Maurice Starr did, he followed the same vein. So once you got the commercial success in New Edition, I'm going to go ahead and do a version of that with New Kids on the Block. But if you listen to New Kids on the Block, the very first record that they had was Please Don't Go Girl, right? So when they come out with Please Don't Go Girl, these guys are doing R&B records. They're doing R&B records. So when you listen to the guy, I remember hearing the record, and I remember black people liking the record because the they're hearing it's R&B, but it's also in the vein of whatever is out. So when you listen to a Joey McIntyre, yeah, he's on his Ralph Tresvant vibe, but the record is basically an R&B record. When you got him singing, when you got what's Mark Donnie Wahlberg,
Mhm.
he's doing the Michael Bivins aspect of it. But what Michael Bivins is doing, Michael Bivins is talking on a record the way they used to talk on Isaac Hayes used to talk on the records. The whole rap version, they were rap and talking. We listen to those R&B records, and you got a vocal spoken passage. Isaac Hayes used to talk on the records. You listen to Harold Melvin, the Blue Notes, and you got a space where Harold is talking on the record, Teddy is talking. That's what Michael Bivins is doing, and that's what Donnie Wahlberg is doing. So he's creating, basically, Maurice Starr is creating that model. He's taking that model, and he's now New Kids on the Block are doing it. But when you look at what New Kids on the Block, they did Please Don't Go Girl, but then after they did the right stuff, everything was pop. So when you look at New Kids on the Block, they were on R&B radio first. The way Madonna was, they broke them on black radio first. And then they went into the pop space. And of course, they became now like anything else. If you're a pop group, white act, now they were the equivalent of that. It's like white people who don't listen to rap music, but they listen to Eminem. It's kind of in that same vein that where you got young kids, that's their version. I would even say that's not their version of New Edition, because New Edition is I consider on the talent, talent wise, and where the pedigree comes from. New Edition is head and shoulders of them over them, but they Maurice Starr creates that model where now he flips the whole concept, turns it upside down. New Edition does their thing, but keep in mind, Maurice Starr is only on, just like how the New Edition was. Maurice Starr was only alone for the ride for like one album, and then by that time, these guys are doing their pop records. Now, when you talk about the boy band component, obviously, New Kids, they kind of set that off. But then when you look at the next ones coming, the 98 Degrees and everybody else, now what they're doing is they're Boys to Men. They're following the model that Boys to Men is doing, because when you look at Boys to Men, even though they're doing the Motown Philly records and all of that, Boys to Men are doing those pop records. LA and Babyface are doing, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis are creating records for these guys that are like, and it's a testament to them. They're doing these crossover records for them. And at the time, when you know this, when Boys to Men are recording records like End of the Road and all those records that LA and Babyface are producing, they don't want to do the records. They want to do records like Jodeci. They want to do R&B records. They don't want to do the pop records, because they're like, you know what? We're not feeling that. But those pop records are allowing those guys to sell out in Vegas for the past 10 years.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah, because I look at when I see Boys to Men, Cooley Eye Harmony is like they're off the wall, while Thriller 2 was their thriller. I prefer Cooley Eye Harmony because Dallas Austin really gave them that bite, that edge, but they really didn't have that pop crossover success until It's So Hard, which was originally done by G.C. Cameron, who was in The Spinners, and it was on the soundtrack for Cooley High. And that they re-released Cooler Harmony in '93 because of the success of End of the Road off of Boomerang, and that really set off the pop phenomenon that was Boyz II Men. Because Motown Philly, when it first came out, it was a slow burn, but once It's So Hard to Say Goodbye to Yesterday, End of the Road came out, that shot them to the moon as far as pop goes.
But see, when you think about this is another thing people kind of forget, is that, yeah, they got all those records, Motown Philly, and it's like now it's kind of, I remember hearing that album, and it was exciting because now you got a Dallas Austin there. So now you starting seeing a younger producers coming to the forefront, and they're doing all the other records like and all of that. But when they did the It's So Hard to Say Goodbye, people of a certain era who grew up watching Cooley High, they made the connection to the record, because that song was, if you watch the Cooley High movie that came out in 1975, GC Cameron's version is at the end of the record. So a lot of us who grew up watching Cooley High when we were 9 and 10 years old, we knew that song. So we were hearing them singing it. But what that song did, it gave Boys to Men a vocal identity. So now when records like End of the Road comes out and a song for Mama, that gives them their identity. Now, mind you, they don't want to do those records. They want to do what Jodeci's doing, because they're looking at that. These other records, they're pop records. So that's not really what they're interested in. But by default, Boys to Men also are coming out of the black R&B tradition of singers, a cappella singers like the Mills Brothers, going back to the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. That's their lane. But also by default, they're creating they're inspiring the whole boy band sound, 98 Degrees and this one and that one, where you see these people singing these romantic records, kind of in the vein of End of the Road. So they kind of birthed that model.
hmm I definitely agree. So let's talk about Jodeci real quick. From my neck of the woods, North Carolina, and how when they got with Uptown, they
Mm-hmm.
transformed from being four country boys to having that inner city bad boy swagger with the Timberlands, the combat boots, and a lot of people do may or may not know that Casey and JoJo started out singing gospel, and then of course Dalvin, Devontae come from that cloth as well. So can we just talk about Jodeci and just their impact in music?
when you look in terms of when you that era, so we're looking at 91, and you start now, it's starting to become commonplace when you're seeing an influx of younger groups, because with Guy, the issues they were having in the music business or whatever, it kind of like derailed those guys to where, they come out with the future, but it's just like the future, and then the next year is Color Me Bad, there's Boys to Men, there's Jodeci. All these groups are coming out, and it kind of like it's like a passing of the torch, so to speak, to where that's the next level. Now younger groups, they're all over the place. Jodeci is dope because now you have, and again, the vocal approach. You got to give credit to Aaron Hall, even though Aaron Hall is the bridge between, he's coming in the vein of Donny Hathaway, Stevie Wonder. The Aaron Hall establishes the template for people to sing the way they sing, that whole gospel range and all of that. So when you look at Casey and JoJo, that's now they continue that because obviously they're inspired by Guy. So you got to give Al B. Sure credit because these guys are raw. They got raw talent. But in the studio, obviously, Al B. Sure, you got to give him a lot of respect because he's there when those records are being, created in the studio. Jodeci was very unique because you had a signature voice.
So,
Jodeci Jodeci was very unique because now they arrived when the template for young contemporary R&B was fully established. In terms of the singing, in terms of the whole look, because even though you had Guy coming out, they had the slick look that they had and the sound that they had. By the time 90 91 rolls around, you know, rap music is starting to become like really dominant as far as young people. So the look that Jodeci had, it was totally different. Even though Guy had that slick look, it was totally different when Jodeci came because they had the sports gear, they had everything else going on. And again, vocally, KC continues the vein of what Aaron Howe establishes for the new young singers. The production is great. It's very sultry. It's very romantic. It's very lush. So if you go back to the old Gamble and Huff productions with the strings and all of that, the Jodeci productions are very, very lush, but the songs are superior. The songs writing is great. So, they had the entire package of that with that. But it's unique because you got two sets of brothers, but obviously Casey and JoJo are the dominant vocalists. So whoever's going on in the background, obviously it's them. But the records that they had were so great, they were consistent, and I think that the music they had, it had this sex appeal to it that groups like Boys and Men didn't have. They had, Jodeci had that edge, but they had edge, but they also had those romantic songs. But the thing, it was good for them, they stayed in their vein because they weren't necessarily a group that was very good at making up tempo records. When they did Gotta Love came and went, but when they locked into those ballads, and that was unique for that time because they're making records just new jack swing, hip hop, soul, where the records are normally mid tempo. You can dance to it, you can bop your head to it. But a lot of Jodeci records were all mid tempo. They would have Get On Up and records like that. But when you look at it, How Do You Wanna? But they were very unique in terms of that particular space. Now,
yes.
live, I've seen Casey and JoJo live when they were a duo. But I just think Jodeci had a sentiment for people who grew up listening to them. I remember they got back together on BET and they did songs from their catalog. But here's the deal: they lip sync all their songs. And it didn't matter to the crowd. They were loving it because it took them back to that time period. So every song that they sang, they lip sync. Now they had a record they did with B.O.B. They sang that live, but they all their hits, they lip synced them.
Yeah, because with KC, we mentioned Bobby Womack earlier, how KC was a hip hop bathed vocalist of Bobby Womack. He covered If You Think You're Lonely Now for Jason's lyric, which is no easy feat to do because Bobby Womack, not everybody can do a Bobby Womack record. I mean, you got to go
Mm-hmm.
through some breakups, divorce, drink a gallon of Jack, and whatever other alcohol is near in order to get that, and how they were unique. Like you mentioned, two set of brothers, Casey, JoJo, Dalvin, Devontae, and Devontae on the production. You mentioned Al B. Shore. And let's just talk about In Effect Mode, that album with him, and of course, Kyle West's cousin on the production, and how when we think of New Jack Swing, the albums that set off that sound, we normally think of Don't Be Cruel, think of Make It Last Forever, we think of Heartbreak and In Effect Mode. So can we just talk about just I'll Be Sure, the impact of that album and its production, songwriting style, along with him and Cal West.
In Effect Mode was a critical album in that space because when you look at the Guy album, even though they had balance, it really leaned towards up tempo records, the up tempo component. Don't Be Cruel, even though you had Rock With You, but it lent itself to more of up tempos. Keep Sweat, obviously, it was very ballad heavy. But when you look at what I'll Be Sure was, even Keep Sweat had the mid tempo joints. But when you look at In Effect Mode, that album was very critical because it it established a different type of singer. So when you listen to the I'll Be Sure, when you look at all those other groups, you had, like I said, you had your up tempos and you had your mid tempos, but I'll Be Sure you're coming out with the ballads, Night and Day, and Ooh This Love Is Soul. Even though you got some New Jack records that are there, but Ooh This Love Is Soul and Naturally Mine and records like that, he just filled that lane, that heartthrob lane, and at that point he's kind of taken over from where you had all the elder barge, light skin type, that was still like super popular. So he had that look that he had, but the records, you put them on and they have a lush production style. So when you go back and when you listen to Luther Vandross records, like If Only for One Night, A Heart Is Not a Home, it kind of was in that vein, but it was an updated style with the technology. Obviously, when you go back to listen to A House Is Not a Home and So Amazing and all of that, there's some technology, but there's a lot of live instrumentation that's there. I'll Be Sure kind of carries that over into the records that he's doing, and it's very lush. So it's the production's a lot of strings, obviously the keys and all of that. And I like how when he's singing it and then it's almost like he's stepping outside of himself. So he's singing a falsetto, but then he's stepping outside of himself, and you hear him sing that baritone. And sometimes it's kind of like, how he has those. He's talking on a record.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like you're lost in that production. So he's like, Kyle West break it down. It's almost like he is. It's almost like when you listen to a Stevie Wonder record, right? And those at that era, they are playing the music and recording the records live in the studio. And when you listen to like the Teddy Riley records, even though he's playing them keys and stuff like that live in the studio, the production is like of those records were like, okay, somebody, you're going in and you're programming the music. But when you're listening to the I'll Be Sure In Effect Mode, it's almost like you can close your eyes and you can picture him. It's like he's in the studio making the music on the spot.
Right, right.
And Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, originally I'll Be Sure was going to be a rapper, and I believe he had a football scholarship to the University of Iowa,
Iowa.
and he
Hmm.
was singing hooks on a lot of those early Uptown records, and his success blew up, and it kind of got me thinking. We had just lost T.J. Swan, who was of the Juice Crew, and how it was not too long after his passing, Marley Marl went on WBLS to play some of the unreleased T.J. Swan records, and he said that he had a deal lined up at Arista, but passed on it. And I was like, man, I'll Be Success probably would have been like, okay, we got something going with TJ Swan because he was the in-house guy singing on all of the Juice Crew stuff on the Cold Chillin' records. And I think TJ Swan would have been a big success if he would have went forward with the Arista deal.
Well, if there's a book out there, it tells the history of cold children. I can look at it. I'm looking at the book in my library right now, but I don't want to walk away. But in the book, they talk about how the success of Bobby Brown and Al B. Sure, now they're like, okay, we can have TJ Swan in that vein. Because one of the things when you look at the singers coming out during that time, they sang, but they didn't sing with the technical ability of a Luther Vandross. They didn't sing with the technical ability of a Freddie Jackson or Alexander O'Neal. They didn't have that skill set. They could sing, but they were kind of like they were more like, and I'll be sure he was like a song stylist. And the difference between a singer and a song stylist, because a song stylist, they can kind of curate and sing different songs, different styles or whatever, where you got a person that's a flat foot singer like a Aretha Franklin. He wasn't like a Luther. He didn't have, I was sure didn't have the pageantry of a Luther Vandross. Bobby Brown didn't sing with the technical skill of like a Peebo Bryson or somebody like that. But with us being young listeners, we didn't care. It was just the feeling and the vibe and who they were. It was a younger version of whatever else that was out there. So when you saw what I'll Be Sure was doing, again, it was very lush. And when you close your eyes, you can just kind of like, it's kind of like when you listen to his records, it's a precursor of what Jodeci is actually doing. So when you look at Forever My Lady, obviously I'll Be Sure is in that, Fiendin', that whole swirling production, and then it's like somebody just poured their vocals, they just dropped their vocals into the music. And that captured the imagination of a lot of people, man. It was like it was there was sexy records. But you were asking me a question about an artist real quick. You said somebody.
About TJ Swan and how because of the success of Al B, Bobby Brown, I think TJ Swan would have blown up if he would have went forward with the Arista deal. And of course, Cold Chillin' was right ahead at the time with the success of Biz Markie, Big Daddy Kane, Fuji Rap, and all the acts that came out of Cold Chillin'.
And in the Cold Children book, they talk about that. They say that, because these guys, Albie Shores and the Bobby Browns, they didn't, when they sang, it was less technical. It was more like a vibe, or it was more like energy. And they felt that even though TJ Swan is singing the records, Nobody Beats the Biz and all of that, they felt like he could be in that vein. Because I did hear a TJ Swan record that he sang. One of those early records. You can find it on YouTube. It's called something love,
Mellow Love.
mellow love. So that gives you an indication of the vibe that he could have actually gone into, because he just had that catchy voice. And during that time, it probably would have worked, because in the age group of people who grew up listening to 90s music, it wasn't about you. It was the music that spoke to you. Because when you saw a lot of artists that would perform, if you noticed that, like if you see Al B. Sure and he was doing the Apollo, and the people are losing their mind, and you listen to Guy perform, and it's dope, but they're singing, the whole delivery, even though we're feeling it, but it's nothing like what is out slightly before. It's not Alexander O'Neal, it's not Freddie Jackson. And obviously that's why a lot of those singers from that era, they were upset, because now you got this version of this 90s music that's coming out, but now there's an audience for that. That's our audience. If you're late teens, early 20s, that's the soundtrack of your life. and we're not expecting these artists to be a Frankie Beverly. We're not
Mhm.
expecting these artists to be a Luther Vandross. We might have loved those people, so we're kind of able to overlook. I don't want to say lack of talent, but we can overlook the blind spots that these artists don't have. Because keep in mind, you got to look at when the '90s comes. That's the dawn of the studio oriented artists. When I say the dawn of the studio oriented artists, is that people are getting signed and they're going straight in the studio making records. Where you have people like the Gladys Knights, where they're out in the OJs. These guys are out before they even making records. They're performing live on stage. They're performing. They got a show before they even make records. So by the time they make records, they're fully developed. The '90s come around where you start seeing a lot. The artists are more raw in their skill set, in their delivery, but they're tailor made for us. That's why sometimes when you see them on stage, the energy sometimes it's hard for them to match that of the record. But at the same time, we don't care because they're for us. So you start
Right.
seeing a drop. I won't say a drop off, but you start seeing a shift in the skill set. And I gotta say, this is you really can't blame them because now when they're coming out, as I said earlier, there are no venues. When young people go out to hear music, they're watching music on videos. So when these people are coming out in the '90s, image is what it is. Unlike the previous generation, when you're going to see mute, when you're going out to hear music, you're going out to watch people perform. So they got to have a stage show. They have to have the stage presence. But these artists or whatever, it was just like they went from straight, they signed them off the street, boom, they went straight into the studio and they made records. So there's a component that doesn't exist with the previous generation, but from our age group and from what we love, we don't care. We're still drawn to them anyway.
Right, right. Let's talk about Foster and McElroy and how their work with Club Nouveau and Tony on the Who album. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have In Vogue. And just how they're, to me, are the unsung heroes who are kind of in the middle. They were before New Jack Swing, in the middle of New Jack Swing, and then they gave us one of the most influential girl groups of all time.
Well, again, Foster and McElroy, you always got to look at the age of these people. These people are older. These people are born at the time when they're coming out making records. They're already deep into their 20s on the cusp of turning 30 years old. So by the time, Club Nouveau was doing Lean on Me in 1986, these guys are already like 30 years old already. So what these guys are able to do is they're able to migrate the new sound. So remember, because it's heavy on the technology, it's heavy on the keyboards, it's very melodic. I like to say it's kind of like an updated version of like what Solar was doing. So when these guys are coming out, they're able to go ahead and come up with I don't want to say a new sound, but they're able to do their variation, their representation of a sound that's coming out that's becoming more and more technology driven.
Mhm.
So they're doing the drum machines and all of that, but the songs are melodic, but also too, the songs are well written. So when you look at what they're doing with Tony, you look at what they're doing with In Vogue, the songs are very mature from a lyrical standpoint. They're not juvenile. They're not like what will come later with younger artists starting to write songs. When you look at the breadth of what In Vogue was able to do, those songs were very good, man. The
Mhm.
range of those records, and of course, when you add the singing with In Vogue and you add the musicianship and the singing with Tony, it was really, really, it was good. Think about it. When you got a song like Little Walter that comes out in 1988, where they're telling a story, and then there's a song that it's about it's like statutory rape. I forgot the
Two
name of the
six
song.
261.9 or point 0.5. It was off the Who album.
That's why you the genius. That's why you the legend, man.
No,
The,
that's you, boss. That's you, boss.
but,
Nah,
but, but yeah, hey, you got the good recall. So think about those. Those records come out in 1988. 3 or 4 years later, you don't hear no records like that at all. So it just goes to show you of Foster McElroy able to write song, even when they're doing songs, like I said, Little Walter. It's just kind of like their storytelling. And that kind of like goes away because in terms of songwriting, because when you look at now later on, people are not necessarily writing songs. They're writing to tracks. You know what I'm
right.
saying? They're writing
Mm-hmm.
to beats. But these guys are lyrically writing songs in
Right.
terms of that. And that kind of sets the tone for what Tony will continue to do, even when they don't, when they leave them. So when you look at Tony got songs that range from My Ex-Girlfriend, which is humor. And that's one of the things that's lost in translation. When black music becomes progressively younger, you don't have a lot of records that are tongue in cheek, that are humorous. That records that in the 70s and 80s, they had records that they were kind of like, you had straight up traditional R&B records, but you can have records that were tongue in cheek, like an Atomic Dog or a Flashlight or whatever records that were out. The Time was another group. They had records that had humor in them. So by the time the 80s rolled around, you didn't have nobody. Cameo was good at making. They had loads and loads of records like that. So Tony kind of like pick up the mantle. So when you talk about the record, he's talking like My Ex-Girlfriend. And he's telling the story about his ex-girlfriend and what she did to him. And then you got records like If I Had No Loot, very clever interpretation of where he's singing about the concept is a universal concept that's going on, where, you didn't want me now, but now I got money. If I had no loot, just Tony was very good at writing songs that were very clever lyrically, and they had humor, you
Right.
know. So, and that's a lost art, you know.
Right, right. And with If I Had No Loot, I found it clever that they sampled the Ice Cube line and you can do that swing on my nuts on the record and how it was a diss, but hey, we're gonna take that, flip it, and sampled it just almost how like Color Me Bad did when they sampled the line from Crossover with Bump Color Me Bad to the TikTok on the Color Me Bad remix on the Young Gifted and Bad remix album. Because it was at that point when you kind of heard those lines where it was kind of like New Jack Swing is kind of sort of fading out, hip hop soul coming in. Now I want you to give me your five underrated male R&B groups of the '90s, five underrated female R&B groups of the '90s. Any order, any
Okay.
way you want to go.
All right. And then real quick, when those sample interjections, like you said, when they have the New Jack, the Ice Cube vocal sample, because here it is that even though New Jack Swing was popular, there's a segment of an audience that did not like that music, because what it was that was like dance music. So you were a hardcore rapper, New Jack Swing was like, But also when you look in terms of what Tony was doing, that record that was almost like a hook. That was like a second hook, to where you incorporating in that. So you're giving, even though they're playing live music, but they got a sample in there, so it's a nod to how people are making records. But it's also some underlying messages that we're not a New Jack Swing artist. Now, don't get me wrong, they love Guy and Guy loved them. That was also a message that, like, hey, you know what? This is what we do. Just like Tribe Called Quest. Q-Tip said strictly such and such a records, not New Jack Swing. So New Jack Swing was this music that was like, it was okay, but for a lot of people, they weren't necessarily really drawn. That wasn't their taste in music. But when
Mm-hmm.
you look in terms of that, it just goes to show you, when you look at that Sons of Soul album, Tony, if you go back and listen to the album, they got about 6 songs. They're doing a variation. Instead of sampling, they're doing variations of R&B records, whether they're singing in a style of other R&B singers or musically, they're doing it, and they will continue to do that with all their records, even to the last record, House of Music. You hear them doing Blue Magic style records. You hear them doing Tower of Power records. Um, just talented. But as far as my five New Jack Swing era records, I would say without the obvious ones that obviously we talk about, the Guy records, and I would say the underrated ones. One, I'll say it's the Bobby album. The Bobby album is an underrated album because it comes out at a time where it's a transition. Just how when Michael Jackson Bad came out,
Mhm.
6 months later, here comes New Jack Swing. Bobby's album was dropped at a time when hip hop soul was about to launch, you know, but and it kind of got lost in the shuffle, even though the record sold a couple million in its time, and it went number one, and then it changed number one slot between them and what's the 411. So the record was well received, but he released the album. Had he released the album in '91, it probably would have hit the same space as Don't Be Cruel. But that album is that's one of my underrated New Jack Swing era albums. The second album that's kind of like underrated for me would probably be I wouldn't really call it underrated, but the Revival. The Revival record kind of like it's a dope album, but that comes out in '91. People love the ballads. The ballads gave the album a lot of traction. Never Rains in Southern California, other those records. But when that Jodeci Boys the Men momentum came in, it was like that really took the steam. So the second album would probably be the Revival. The third album that would probably be underrated for me would probably be God, a Future album. Same situation. When the Future album dropped, it had a spot, and as it rolled into '91, boom, here come the other groups. So those would be my three from on the male side. I'm adding female. I would probably Funky Divas. Funky Divas is probably my fourth, and the range of that album is so great. Of course, people they love the album, but people don't talk about that album enough. The range, I think the songs will upgrade from Born to Sing. So that's my number four, and then my number five album is kind of. I'm trying to think. If I had to do a fifth one,
See, you're thinking. Think long and hard. I mean, there's so many acts, so many ways that we can go as far as underrated because it was an era where groups were coming out like crazy. So you had to really know, like, okay, this act wasn't big here in the States, but big in Europe. So go ahead and give me your last one.
Today.
Ooh, good one. I was going to mention today as well because whenever I hear Big Bub sing, to me, he's like if Luther Vandross went full blown New Jack Swing hip hop soul.
I'm gonna tell you, today was dope because obviously they had a signature voice. Great singers. You know what? I'm gonna put the album I'm gonna have is gonna be Today the New Formula. That's the album. I'm gonna remove the Today first album, but the New Formula, that album is highly underrated. They got songs like I Wanna Come Back Home. Just that album, to me, that album is, even though I love the first album, but for song, the second album to me is superior because it's a more mature sound.
Right.
So those are my five, and if I had to do an honorable mention, it probably would be Basic Black's album.
hmm Yeah, Basic Black, Cold Group, some of my underrated albums from New Jack Swing era. I put Intro's debut album, Joe Public's album, Shomari's album. I forgot the name of the
Mm-hmm.
album. I would put 511. They were signed to RCA, had a record called Say It Isn't Over, and then had a ballad
Mm-hmm.
called Don't Cry.
Mm-hmm.
It's Real by The Real Seduction. They were a four-man vocal group out of New Orleans, signed to Atlantic, had a record called Ain't Nothing Wrong, written by Kenny Green, RIP. And for females, I'll go Surrender by Cut Close, Brownstone's debut album, and then I will put Jeanne's debut album on there. And nobody talks about KG enough. I mean, for the work that he did with Naughty, Jeanne and Coffee Brown, and later Jaheim.
Well, a lot of those albums that you name are really dope albums, but I also categorize a lot of them when everything is going toward the uh hip hop soul vein, like the intro albums and stuff like that. Because by the time they come out, New Jack Swing is kind of like shifted, and everything now is in the vein of what's coming out after what's the 411. Now
Mm.
it's
Oh yeah,
you got the sample loops, but those are some dope albums. But um I'm intro was dope. I love them, but I'm gonna tell you, their second album kind of
New Life,
reminds me of like what Today was doing. It was called New Life.
the New Life album.
New Life, even though that New Life album, what it was that it kind of was Kenny Green, that was the direction that he was going into. A lot of personal things going on in his life, but the song for song, each song sounded totally different from another. But the background vocals and the lead vocals on New Life, that album, perfect. I mean, it to me, in terms of '90s albums, I would put the album like in my top 10 easy, just
Right,
because of the variety of the songs, the singing, the background vocals. Because one of the things that was lost in a lot of '90s music when they mixed the records, you didn't hear a lot of background vocals. The lead vocals were always mixed higher, and the background vocals were not as they were mixed. They were down in the mix, but you have some exceptions. Like when you look at vocals, Casey and JoJo's vocals, but a lot of the music during that time, the background vocals were kind of like mixed. They were kind of like low in the mix, but
right.
yeah, lot of great music during that time.
Right, and then two albums I also put in there would be Prince Marky D and the Soul Convention free album, and then the Changes album by Christopher Williams, which I felt he really found his footing once he was able to get out of that Geffen contract and go over to Uptown.
Yeah, and exactly. And I just think that when you look at that time period, man, it was so much music out there. And of course, being a listener, and at that point, I probably was in my early to mid 20s. So I'm hearing the artists, and it was just great music to listen to. I think the only downfall is that those artists were record artists and they weren't like performance based artists. They were really like, I like to call them, they were a producer's medium. And what I mean by that is when you're a producer, everything is filtered through the vision and the idea of a producer. And of course, those artists, they never lasted long, or they never were able to establish a visual presence that would have given them the longevity. So, whoever was the hot producer, whoever was producing at the time, the music was dope. The music was hot. But as far as the longevity and from a visual aspect of it, there weren't too many artists whose visual stage aspect of it lived up to the energy of the records. So of course you got a handful, whether it's In Vogue, New Edition, Bobby Brown to a certain space, Johnny Gill. And even when you look at what Bobby Brown was doing, Bobby Brown kind of, when he came out with the Bobby album, hip hop was like really becoming dominant. So it was like his whole vibe. It's like he kind of left what he was doing during Don't Be Cruel, where he kind of was in his Michael Jackson vein, to
Mhm.
where now you're kind of doing the Belle Biv DeVoe background dancer. You got all these dancers or whatever that is, and it's like the hip hop posturing. You're dressing like a hip hop artist. You're kind of interjecting whatever is hot in the energy of '90s hip hop. And to
Right,
me, I just felt that the dancing and everything that he was doing in '88 and '89, it was really super dope. And I think had he stayed in that vein of just being a singular dancer performer, it just would have been really, really dope. But I think that the way hip hop was going during that time, you had to interject that energy of what hip hop was, the dance moves, what they used to do, and everything. So it was less R&B ish till it started to become more and more hip hop. And I think he lost something in translation. But those records, song for song, they were dope. They were
Yeah,
very dope.
hopefully we'll see a release of the Mystical Magical album because that was the album that had Tap Into My Heart on it, which he performed on the 1990 MTV Video Music Awards, where New Edition had the reunion with all six, which was a precursor to Home Again, but that album never came. It kind of had that same vibe of Don't Be Cruel on Our Own, and I think had they would have released that album, it definitely would have did gangbusters. But another album I would mention and most underrated right around 93, 94, 95. For me, Tony Thompson's Sexational album.
Tony Thompson is another guy. He had a unique voice, but he just did, I think at that time, certain people going solo, it works. And for some people going solo, it just does not work. He had a unique voice. And I just think that, we already know the history of High Five and everything that they went through. But I think that with him, he even when he the Sensational album, he had people who were working with him. I think it was Puff and all those guys or whatever that is. I think that the material, to me, he was probably one of the most underrated and dynamic singers of that area. Of that era. He was like the way how Tevin Campbell and Michael Jackson was. He could narrate and he could deliver a song, any type of song, whether it was ballads, up tempo. And I just think that even though the album was dope, he didn't have an opportunity to show what he could fully do. But by that time, it was so many artists that were out at that time in the 90s. People get lost in the shuffle, man.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was talking about because there was an R&B girl group that was posted on this Facebook group that I'm in called
Mhm.
Shades. Come, they were signed to Motown like around 96, 97. Come to find out Ray Allen's wife was in that group. And I was
Yes, you know
like,
what? It's not.
oh, I don't remember him, but that just goes to show you how deep the field was for 90s R&B male and female groups that they were just coming out and it's like, oh, I don't remember that group, but their stuff sounded pretty good. And you was gonna say something
I
about Shades?
remember that. I remember that. I was just reading something about Ray Allen a couple of days ago, and I was reading about his wife. Her name was Shannon Walker, and she was in the group. But I just think about it was so many ex girlfriend. I'm gonna tell you in the '90s. I think the reason why people love the '90s so much is that those people, even though the production style, that was the production style that we loved, obviously. But at that same time, a lot of people were doing a variation of the older music. They was talking about romance and relationships, Brownstone, if you love, all those records like that. So they resonated with us. It was just the music for our era, but because it was so much and the industry was so producer driven, it was great to have all of these different type of albums, CDs, or whatever to pull from because it was so much. But overall, there was a lot of great music in the 90s. There was a lot of good music, and there was some music that may have not so good across the board, but it was so much to go ahead to draw from that it's an era that people now who are younger, who are like 30 and 20 and 15 years old, they're looking at 90s music and they're like, wow, I was born in the wrong era. So
Mm-hmm.
90s music is like what 70s music was for us.
Right, right. And I want to touch on these two quick points and I'll get you out of here. The second British invasion you mentioned earlier, you had Sade, Junior, Five Star, 52nd Street, Loose
Well, the
Ends,
black, but
the
that's the black
yeah,
that's early 80s. That's early mid 80s.
okay.
So when you look at Junior comes out in 80, 81. So what happens is you have a period of time where the reason why when you look at like the British people when it came to their music, England had a lot of wars going on. So Europe had a lot of wars going on for so many years. So it stifled their development of creating their homegrown music. And they were influenced by American music. So no matter who was coming out on the British side, whether you were a white act or black act, you took your cues from American music in a lot of ways. So when you look at like the loose ends, 52nd Street, loose ends were produced by a guy named Nick Martinelli from Philly. He started out producing their records, and then they started producing their own records. 52nd Street was produced by Nick Martinelli. So Junior was coming out doing his records or whatever. People don't realize Heat Wave. Heat Wave was a group made up of Europeans. You had the two Americans, Johnny Wilder and Keith Wilder, the main two guys, but everybody else was from Europe. So that there was a British invasion in the early to mid 80s that existed on the black side for R&B records. So then what happened is on the heels of that, 84, 85, through 80, through the end of the 80s, you start seeing all these British groups. Even though, think about it, you had, I would say going back to 81, Flock of Seagulls, Duran Duran, you had that whole vibe that these people had this visual image. They fit the music video. So when the music videos were playing, they fit into that vibe.
Mm-hmm.
Say what you were saying
Yeah,
now?
and real quick sidebar with Heat Wave, Rod Temperton. There was a story about how when he was working on Michael for Off the Wall, he would always give Heat Wave first cracks at any records that he was working on for Michael. And Heat Wave passed, and on a lot of those records that he passed on ended up becoming big hits for Michael.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you ever heard of the Carpenters, the
Yep,
Karen Carpenter?
yep, yep.
Some of those songs that Michael Jackson will wind up recording, he also offered some of those songs to Karen Carpenter too.
Hmm.
So, because when you listen to the harmonies of Karen Carpenter, the stacked vocals, Rob Temperton is writing in that vein. And one thing about people don't realize songwriting. Rod Temperton, if you look at his catalog that he's writing, he's very good. You know how like later on you got Chris Brown and Usher and a lot of songs they're writing, Love in the Club, songs are written around a club environment.
Mm-hmm.
Rob Temperton was a master at writing about the nightlife, whether it was Light Up the Night, Stomp, Give Me the Night, Off the Wall, Groove Line, Boogie Nights. Everything he's writing is about nightlife.
Wow, interesting. And then
Razzmatazz,
yeah.
Razzmatazz with Patty Austin. She's singing about nightlife, club life. Yeah, he's a master at that, man.
Yeah, one of the greatest to ever touch a pen in the pad. And what do you think about today's space of music now, to where it's no labels? You're putting out what you want to put out, no middleman, and you appeal to who you want to appeal to in today's music space.
I think what it is that music starting around maybe in the 2010s. Music started to kind of go back to what I like to call a singles format. So when you look at like 2009, 2010, that's like the last era where you start seeing like the physical music, the CDs, right? So then when the music went into a streaming component, it became singles driven. Now, before albums on the black side, black music used to be singles driven because the mentality was that black people did not buy albums. That's why when you listen to Motown albums, you might have one or two singles, but everything is filler. So you don't see the arrival of black albums in a full creative capacity until like around 1970, 71, 72, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Donny Hathaway. So now fast forward to the streaming era, you see black music went to a singles format, to where now if somebody put out a music, like when you were buying music in the 90s, you loved that the albums and the songs had 15, 16 songs on them. But nowadays everything is single driven, and that's why you got an artist like, they say Drake is now, he's past Elvis, he's past the Beatles with all of the singles that he's released. But to me, that's a major accomplishment for him. But would Drake be as a dominant artist if he was putting out music in the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s? Because now when you look at singles, it kind of like it almost kind of like pads the competition. And when we look at these people, we look at them as being more successful what they where they are because yeah, you putting out singles all the time. But the great thing about it is that when you're putting out singles in the streaming era, you don't have to be all things to everybody. You got to understand with black music, you always had to have pop records to be, you had to be leaning toward pop records to be successful or to get on the charts. Or when SoundScan came out in 91, if you were selling 150,000, 200,000, 300 albums for its first week, that was going to guarantee you, pop success. But then what happened was what streaming did, it evened the playing field because now it opened the door for artists. You can be a niche artist. You can be a niche artist. You don't have to come out. You can come out with a single. And also now the medium has changed because people now they don't digest, they don't consume music the way people consume music 20 years ago. It's single driven. So now you can come out with a single, multiple singles, and you're good to go because people digest music that way with streaming. You create your own playlist. So coming out with albums or whatever, even though it's great for our favorite artists, it doesn't carry unless you're a deep music fan. It doesn't resonate. So in one sense, now you can come out with music and you don't have to worry about selling 150,000 copies the first week. As an R&B artist, you can put the music out and it's basically have the music out in the marketplace. But now from a business perspective, the loss of physical product mean that people cannot really earn the revenue that they would actually make. And I think that when the music went from the physical product and the streaming, I think black music was most affected because black music relied on those budgets. They relied on the producer budgets. They relied on the video budgets. So, because black music in the 90s, especially in the early 2000s going into the 2010s, they really relied on music videos, and all that. But when all that stuff went away, it's like the bottom fell out for a lot of artists. But it's no different. It's a merry-go-round. Just the way when you saw people like Luther and Freddie and people Bryson was hot, and next thing you know, you got Aaron Hall and you got Big Bub and you got this one and that one is hot. And then next thing you know, somebody's coming up and they're replacing them. It's a merry-go-round. So, that's kind of how I see it. I miss the aspect of having the long form of music, but then now it's great to, you have the singles you can pull from. But now it just seems like it's so much music. Well, I never thought I would be so overwhelmed because I lived in music stores. I lived for seeking out music, but it becomes so much. Everybody's an artist now, man.
Yeah, the bar of entry is pretty much been erased. Where if you have a connection, laptop, and some equipment, you can put it out there. But once again, you get to find your niche, cater to them. You don't have to necessarily have to worry about catering to the masses, where you could just appeal who you want to appeal to, and that'll be that. So, do you have any shout outs you want to give before we conclude this interview?
I want to shout you out because again, I remember listening to your audio interviews or whatever, and just it was very interesting because I had never heard anyone doing interviews of the artists from that time period. And we talking about I'm listening to your joints. It's got to be over 15 years ago. So
Mhm.
you were putting in a lot of work doing that way before everyone else has, and then being able and you had that recall, you had that history because I would listen to you pull from different areas and you would reference to certain type of things and it was really good. So you were ahead of the curve. So I want to go ahead and just shout you out for doing that, and then for being able to adapt your format from what you were doing back then now to behind the album cover, and that's important because we don't have album covers. We don't have history is lost. History is lost because we don't have a visual element of what came of that accompanies the music. So right
Mhm.
now we got social media, but the problem is with social media, everything is happening in real time with the artists that there's no concept of the history because everything
Mhm.
is happening in real time. So once that stuff is on social media, people have moved on to the next content. So now we're not really caught up. We're not tuned to the history. Like these artists that are out now, it may be a situation where there may not be anybody talking about their history because the history is already out there
Mhm.
compared to the history never has never been told from a 90s perspective. That's why it's so rich because there's so many different elements. So that's the thing with social media now, the era music is coming out, whether it's good, whether it's bad or indifferent, it's just a different vibe. But the historical content, the backdrop of the music, um, it's lost
Right.
compared to the spiritual, I mean, the historical backdrop of the music that came before it. It doesn't mean that the music is completely trash. It's just different, a different aura. But keep in mind the people who are listening to the music 15, 18, 25, 30 years old, it's tailored to them. So whatever they're getting from it is what we got from 90s music, what people got from 80s music, what people got from 70s music. So it's just a different medium, different time, different artists, and different platform.
Right,
You know,
I agree, and I appreciate your compliment on the work that I did on the Time Machine, and everybody that's listened to any interview that I've done, whether it be Beyond the Album Cover or Time Machine. I thank you, and you can catch this interview wherever you stream podcasts and on the official YouTube channel at youtube.com/Beyond the Album Cover. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you for Sheldon Taylor. You have one more thing to mention before we wrap?
I got one more thing for anybody who's interested in reading long form um documented history on a lot of black music. I have some pieces that I've written about with 90s contemporary music, and the site is called Souls of Black Notes at blogspot.com. Souls of Black Notes at blogspot.com. I have over 150 long form articles that reference a lot of the music that has come out over the past few years, whether you're looking at the Michael Jacksons, the Jaheems, the 90s music, kind of in the vein of what you're doing. I've done it in long form writing. So check that out.
Souls of Black Notes at blogspot.com. People check that out, and you can check this interview out wherever you stream podcasts and on the official YouTube channel at youtube.com/Beyond the Album Cover. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you for writer and music historian Sheldon Taylor for coming on Beyond the Album Cover. Sheldon, thank you for coming on. I hope to do it again with you soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir.